Hello, I am Steve Hounsell, Chair of the Ontario Biodiversity Council. I'd like to welcome all of you to our Ontario Biodiversity Summit, Nature-Based Solutions for the 21st Century. I also want to briefly introduce you to the Ontario Biodiversity Council, now in its 16th year, and the host of this summit. We are a provincial level organization that has come together to achieve the vision and higher order goals and targets. Hello, I am Steve Hounsell, Chair of the Ontario Biodiversity Council. I'd like to welcome all of you to our Ontario Biodiversity Summit, Nature-Based Solutions for the 21st Century. I also want to briefly introduce you to the Ontario Biodiversity Council, now in its 16th year, and the host of this summit. We are a provincial level organization that has come together to achieve the vision and higher order goals and targets that have been set by Ontario's biodiversity strategy, a 10-year strategy that aligns with the Global Strategic Plan for Biological Diversity and its associated IACHI targets. That strategy is a blueprint championed by Council for an ecologically sustainable future for Ontario, its biodiversity, and its people, something we believe is well worth pursuing. We occupy a unique space that links global biodiversity targets with both national efforts and more local implementation efforts. We are working to mainstream biodiversity across all sectors and at all scales in an effort to protect what sustains us. It is embodied in the very membership of Council, with some 38 organizations from a broad constituency of industry and industry associations, conservation and environmental groups, natural heritage institutions, academia, Indigenous organizations, and the provincial government, all united around the theme of protecting what sustains us, our biodiversity. So again, I welcome you to our virtual summit. We hope that the summit will connect people from across Ontario, Canada, and around the world to talk about, celebrate, and most importantly, take action to protect biodiversity and advance nature-based solutions for a more sustainable future for all. You'll be hearing about the alarming state of biodiversity at multiple scales, including from here in Ontario, and the absolute need to bend the curve on biodiversity loss as we pursue a new deal of people living in harmony with nature. It is also an issue that is intertwined both in causation and in solutions with climate change and the pursuit of sustainable development goals, and hence our focus on nature-based solutions. More importantly, you will be hearing about practical solutions to move us towards a more inspired future for all. Remember, the future is all about choices, choices that we collectively make. We will be hosting a number of webinar sessions starting in late May and ending in October. You can find descriptions and outlines of each session on our website, ontariobiodiversitycouncil.ca. We encourage you to register for as many as you can, and yes, they are free. I believe there is something in this summit for just about everyone. We have brought together leading edge thinkers and experts on biodiversity, together with practitioners from many fields to help lead the way towards meaningful, practical, and cost-effective solutions. Let this be the start of an inspired journey to a more sustainable future. We also realize that we need many perspectives, and most notably, Indigenous perspectives, knowledge, and connectedness to nature in order to achieve the transformative change that we so desperately need to address the issues of biodiversity loss and climate change and the pursuit of sustainable development. Now, this was not a small undertaking. It takes a lot of work and organization to pull off such an event. I want to thank our summit planning team and session leads from the Ontario Biodiversity Council. These folks have been working tirelessly for months to bring this summit together. Thank you so much for getting us to where we are. In particular, I want to thank Sarah Rang, Executive Director, and Colin Cassels of the Invasive Species Center for hosting our webinar sessions. It is a huge and much appreciated contribution. And a very special thank you to our sponsors. Sponsors like Ontario Power Generation and Ducks Unlimited Canada, among others. It is because of their collective support that this summit is happening. I also want to respectfully recognize lands where we reside and from where we work. Since time immemorial, the Indigenous peoples were self-reliant and well provided for through their own ingenuity and use of the gifts of the land. living in harmony with the balance of nature. We, the Ontario Biodiversity Council, acknowledge that the land where we meet on and strive to protect is the territory of the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee peoples, but now is home to many diverse First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. That is also true for the many people participating in our summit who may be residing on unceded lands. I'd also like to recognize the critically important role of our Indigenous peoples in conserving biodiversity as teachers of traditional knowledge, for promoting and enlightening us on ethical space and two-eyed seeing, and as valued members of the Ontario Biodiversity Council. I'd now like to ask Dorothy Taylor, Elder, Water Walker, and Knowledge Keeper of Curve Lake First Nation, to share some important words with all of you. And first, by way of introduction, Dorothy Taylor is a Mississauga Ojibwe elder from Curve Lake First Nation. She is known for her work and traditional teachings about the sacredness of water. She shares traditional knowledge and ceremony within her community and various organizations throughout Ontario. She is a hand drummer and a singer. Elder Dorothy Taylor is the founder of the Sacred Water Circle, inspired by traditional Indigenous teachings and leading with hope and spiritual courage. The Sacred Water Circle sees a restored relationship between human communities and water. She has served as a volunteer on the Petroglyph Advisory Council of Curve Lake for 12 years. Currently, Dorothy is the co-chair of the local United Nations Sustainable Development Goal 6 on clean water and sanitation, sponsored by the Kawartha World Issue Center. She lives in Curve Lake with her husband, Mark, and 2 sons. Over to you, Dorothy.
Oh, Chimigwat, Steve. Nimki Kapanashi-kwa, Dishnaka, Swabagog Dodem, Washkika Mong Donjaba. Gitchanendam Sanongam, Minka Kinamage Au Sagil Sustainable Development should call that. My name is Dorothy Taylor, and I'm very, very happy to be here and be invited to be speaking regarding Indigenous environmental knowledge to such an esteemed group of people who have worked so hard and care so much for our natural world. I was asked to share a little bit about my understanding of Indigenous environmental knowledge. And first of all, what I want to say about that is, as Indigenous people, and I'm talking around the world, the globe, that we see, we feel, and we interact with the natural world more of a familial relationship. As you know, we refer to the globe of Mother Earth as Mother. We call her Mother. When we gaze upon the sun in the sky, we refer to the sun as Grandfather. And when we look upon the moonlight sky, the moon is Grandmother. And all the trees and animals and insects and the birds, they're our brothers and sisters. So you see how we have a familial relationship with the land, not necessarily a stewardship, because in our stories of creation, water was created first, the land was created next, and everything else was created that lives upon this world. But it was the human people, us, the 4 colors of man, that came to this land, the Mother Earth experience, I call it, because we're only here for a short time. We were here last. And so they welcomed us as the children of the earth. So when we refer to our interaction with the natural world as stewards, to me, the word steward is the definition as, you know, as maybe something in which a person controls or organizes their interaction with the world. And, you know, that's not our job. We have to have a different perspective on how we interact with the land and with the water. Because to Indigenous people, The water itself has a spirit, a living spirit. And the lakes, the oceans, the rivers, even the water that falls from the sky, it is it is it is the veins of Mother the Earth. And when we interact with the water, our elders say that we must show gratitude to the or speak gratitude towards the water. So many of you who work on the land and you're always near water, say on a daily basis in your language, be it English, Korean, Chinese, Italian, or Ojibwe, which is miigwech. Say miigwech to that water. It hears us and it has a memory. In terms of the land and the trees and the air and the fire, you know, these are elements that must be treated with respect. So we have more of a spiritual relationship with the land. It's more than an element. It's more than it goes beyond being a resource. We actually have a spiritual, familial relationship with the land. So as the four colors of man, we must all remember our original directions as we left the Creator's side. And just in brief reference to a certain part of our creation story, the white race was given the obligation to look after the air. The yellow race to look after the element of fire. The black race to look after the element of fire of water, and the red race to look after the land. As Native people in the on Turtle Island, which is the continent of North America, we believe that we still remember our obligation, and that's the obligation to the land. As you know, when you turn on the TV and you look on the news, it's always the Indigenous people who are leading many of those protests on oil and mining and forestry and such, because we believe that there are certain places on our land that have a spiritual power. It's a sacred place. Sacred meaning it has a connection to the higher power. So what I shared with you today in conclusion is that number one, we have a familiar relationship to the land. We believe that land, water, sky, and air, we have a spiritual relationship with it, with creation. And also, it's very important that on a daily basis, we speak gratitude towards those gifts the Creator gave us. And that we're not necessarily stewards of the land, but primarily we must live in harmony. And we have to live in a balanced relationship with the land. So what I shared with you today, I just hope that what our elders from present and beyond and prior, who have taught me the little bit that I'm sharing with you today, that this will help you in the work as you go forward as professionals and in the work that you do. So I say miigwech for inviting me and to sharing a little bit that I know, and I wish you luck and have fun on this biodiversity and this group this conference that you're participating in webinar. Now miigwech, meet you.
Thanks very much, Dorothy, for your incredible words of wisdom, and Steve for your opening comments as well. My name is Rob Keane. I'm the CEO of Forests Ontario, and it's a great pleasure to be the moderator for today's session of looking at mainstreaming biodiversity within forestry. But before proceeding, I also would like to respectfully acknowledge that I am on the traditional territory of the Chippewa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi peoples under the terms of the Robinson-Huron Treaty number 61 of 1850 and the Williams Treaty of 1923. Together, we honor all Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit for their cultures, their languages, their wise teachings and ways of being, their stewardship and protection of the lands and waters and life that have shaped this country since time began. Together, we commit to acknowledge, to learn, to educate, to create opportunity, and to honor sacred places, and to take actions towards real truth and reconciliation in support of our commitment to wellness for all and to walking the path together in respect, peace, and harmony for future generations. Chimigwech. Now on with the session. I've had the great privilege of working in the forestry sector for close to 40 years. Well, this seems like a long time. It is a long time. And I've been involved with the development of Crown Forest Management Plans, private land forest plans, land use planning, development of certification standards, tree marking, and private land tree planting. What I've learned over that time is that our Canadian forestry practices address multiple values that we all hold dear to our hearts, including enhancing wildlife habitat for multiple species, providing for recreational opportunities for tourism and individuals. Also, the supporting the multiple biological values, including terrestrial values, water quality, and fish habitat. And certainly can't forget about the sustainably produced forest products that we all enjoy. And more recently, the values associated with healthy growing forests and their connection to carbon sequestration in the fight against climate change. The underlying principle of our forest management practices here in Canada is to ensure the continuance of our highly diverse ecosystems and thereby high degree of biodiversity. Likewise, what I've also discovered over the years is the perception that forestry and biodiversity is an either-or proposition, and that this isn't prevalent in the academia world, high levels of government, and people's overall views of forestry. Whereas in fact, sustainable forestry and all the values considered are highly complementary of ensuring long-term biodiversity. Now, there might be some that would take exception to that comment. And just as an example, somebody might say, well, what about those red pine plantations, the monocultures? And I would remind people and to get them to understand that the monocultures are a means to an end and incorporate the succession of forests to achieve a highly diverse forest in a relatively short time frame. Just one example of how forestry works towards ensuring that long-term biodiversity. I'm hopeful that today's session and our illustrious panel of presenters will provide further insights into mainstreaming biodiversity within forestry. Now, in the interest of time, all of our speakers' bios are available on the OBC Summit website for your consideration. So I'd ask that you would check those out when you have time. They're very, very impressive. Also, if you have any questions, they can be posted via the chat line, and I'll try to get to those at the end of everyone's presentations. Now, with that, I'd like to call upon our first speaker, Scott Jackson. Scott is the Director of Conservation of the Forest Products Association of Canada. Scott is a graduate of Toronto's MFC program and a lifelong advocate for enhancing the awareness of our forestry systems here in Canada. Scott, I'm going to hand it over to you. Thanks very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Rob, for those kind words, and I hope everybody can see and hear me. I believe I have control of the slides now. Anyways, I'm just waiting for my first slide to advance, but off the top, we'd just like to express a heartfelt thank you to the Ontario Biodiversity Council, Steve, Rob, Colin, Mike, Sarah, for all your hard work in putting this together, and obviously for the opportunity and the invitation to speak today. Dorothy, I'd like to thank you for your opening words. I'm speaking to you today from Toronto, and I would just like to acknowledge that I am on the traditional territories of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and Toronto is currently home to peoples of many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis peoples. With that in mind, I'll jump into my presentation. As Rob mentioned, my name is Scott Jackson. I am the Director of Conservation Biology at the Forest Products Association of Canada. And just by way of an overview of my presentation, just waiting for the slide to move forward. I'll give you just a very quick overview of our organization, a little bit of context and perspective around the resource, Canada's forests, and then really get into the meat of the presentation, which is mainstreaming biodiversity into forestry, sustainable forest management planning and operations. And I've tried to divide that into two components. One is the commitment, which is really reflected in either policy or voluntary measures, and then the practice, so what we actually see on the ground. And then I'll conclude with just a short note on monitoring and accountability. So the Forest Products Association of Canada is a national trade association for the forest sector. We provide a voice for the forest product producers across the country and represent their interests on national and international forestry-related matters. So that can be interacting with governments, on regulatory frameworks, that can be issues around innovation, it can include trade, and of course it includes conservation and biodiversity. This is a list of our member companies. That was a list of our member companies. Our members typically operate in multiple provinces. Many of them have international presence. Our membership is represented in every province with the exception of Prince Edward Island, Nova Scotia, and Newfoundland. In terms of the resource, this is just an overview, a little bit of context on the different forest regions of Canada. And obviously the boreal forest region is that large light green swath that goes from coast to coast to coast. You know, the most prevalent forest region we have in the country, but do want to draw everyone's attention to the fact that we do have a very diverse range of forest regions in the country. And even though the boreal forest, which represents about 75% of our forest regions, is the largest, there is a lot of diversity within the boreal forest as well, and that can be from an administrative point of view, and that can also be from an ecological point of view. So obviously, you know, when you're dealing with a country as large as Canada, one of the largest forest nations in the world, and when you overlay that level of diversity on top of it, it can obviously create some challenges from a national level or a federal level in terms of the regulatory frameworks and addressing the whole suite of values, including conservation and biodiversity. So those are the forest regions. This next slide is intended just to give a little bit of a breakdown, more from a regulatory standpoint. And so what it does is it does two things. One, it shows where the actual forests exist within those forest regions. So not all of a forest region has trees on it. There can be bare rock, there can be natural meadows, there can be wetlands, lakes and rivers, etc. And while they may not have trees on them directly, they do certainly support biodiversity values and need to be considered in the conversation. But what this map does is it shows you, one, where the actual forest land cover exists, and that's that dark green cover. And you can see a little darker shade within the pink. That pink is the managed area. So that's the area that's regulated for forestry operations, sustainable harvesting and renewal practices. And you can see the majority of that is that darker shade, which has forest, but again, not all of it. And just as a quick overview, I really just want to emphasize that less than 50% of our forest resource is actually available for sustainable forest management planning and operations, with the balance either in protected areas or in unmanaged forests, which are handled very differently by both the federal and the provincial or territorial governments. Want to talk just quickly about ownership, because obviously this is very vital when it comes to the establishment and implementation of regulatory frameworks. You know, some 90% of our lands are owned or governed, I should say, by the provinces and the territories. 6% is privately owned. Only 4% is owned or managed by the federal government. So again, that provides some important considerations when we talk about a national or federal level approach to forest management from coast to coast to coast. And then one last comment on the resource itself, but really want to drive home the fact that our forest resources, our forest lands are dynamic ecosystems, most notably the boreal forest, a very fire-driven, insect disturbed area. And this just gives a snapshot of comparing the area that's harvested on an annual basis, relative to the area that's either impacted by insects or the area burned. And you can see it's just a smaller fraction of the total area that is harvested and sustainably renewed, but 25 times the area is impacted through natural disturbances. And this is very important when we get into the discussion around how we sustainably manage our forests, and obviously how we incorporate biodiversity and biodiversity values into the forest management planning system. Okay, so on to the actual how we mainstream biodiversity. And so this is on the commitment part. This is looking at the frameworks that we operate under. You can see that there's a whole suite of considerations and entry points for biodiversity. There's federal legislation and regulations, there's provincial legislations and regulations, and I know Ian will talk a little bit more about that in the Ontario context. There are also voluntary considerations. So forest certification, I'll touch on that at the very end of the presentation, but that's a voluntary standard, a voluntary approach whereby you have to meet a third-party independent standard, and that gains you marketplace access. All of those elements then feed into company policies and procedures, standard operating procedures, how things are done on the ground to ensure that operations are consistent. With all those other considerations, there is community involvement. That can be local snowmobile clubs, local stakeholders, indigenous communities. And then at the end, a forest management plan needs to be developed that's signed off on by a registered professional forester. And do just want to highlight that indigenous involvement is a part of all of those different elements. So you can see that it could become fairly complex, but I'm going to start by just touching on that higher level bar there, federal legislations and regulations. So again, when we consider that most of the land is under the jurisdiction of the provinces or territories, I'm just waiting for this slide to advance. There we go. It may raise the question around, okay, well, what happens at a national level? Or, where does the federal government get involved, or anyone that's sort of involved at that national level, including the private sector. And there are multiple pieces of legislation, multiple acts, but just wanted to mention three that are very key when it comes to addressing and incorporating biodiversity into how things are done. One is the Species at Risk Act, one's the Migratory Birds Convention Act, and one is the Fisheries Act. And there are considerations around jurisdiction with all of these. So the Species at Risk Act gives immediate jurisdiction to the federal government on federal lands, or for federally governed species. And it does provide safety nets in terms of its application to provincial or territorial land, but those are discussions that need to be had, and the immediate jurisdiction is not necessarily there. It's something that requires a bit of due diligence before any of those safety net protocols are put in place. Migratory Birds Convention Act, federal government has jurisdiction and authority over migratory birds and their nests, and Fisheries Act, the federal government has jurisdiction and authority over waterways, fish and fish habitat. So yet at the same time, if you remember that previous slide, that that's one consideration of one element that needs to fit into or feed into provincial and territorial regulatory frameworks. But these federal acts do inform both provincial and territorial approaches to sustainable forest management and biodiversity specifically. So yeah, it's just an important consideration. And I'm still waiting for the next slide. So this is just an example. So on the left, you've got your federal statutes. On the right, you've got British Columbia. And you can see those three acts. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but the Fisheries Act, Migratory Birds Convention Act, Species at Risk Act, all here. This is now the Impact Assessment Act, which was revised in 2019 the formal Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, but it's just overarching legislation. But you can see here, you know, from these three key pieces of legislation, that then informs how things are done at the province to a degree. And there needs to be sort of that dovetailing or that meshing or that common understanding between the provincial regulatory frameworks and the federal government's regulatory frameworks. And I do think it's fair to say that we are seeing an increase in the number of agreements, collaborations between the federal government and provincial governments when it comes to the application of those federal statutes, in terms of recognizing how they are currently addressed by provincial regulatory frameworks, and where additional discussion might be required. So that's just to give you a little bit of a synopsis in terms of just how complex this can be. But just quickly, just want to mention, you know, it is at the provincial or territorial level where the rubber really hits the road. Again, that's where the jurisdiction exists in terms of governing forest management. That's where most forestry specific laws, regulations, and policies are created. But just on that commitment level, these are just a few excerpts from either legislation or policies across 3 provinces that really demonstrate that commitment to long-term health of our forests, which of course is a foundation for biodiversity moving forward. So in British Columbia, you know, sustainable forest management is defined as management that maintains and enhances the long-term health of our forest ecosystems. Obviously, you know, to Rob's opening comments, discusses other environmental, economic, social, and cultural opportunities and values. But just want to emphasize it's that long-term health that comes first. We see the same thing in Saskatchewan, where they, you know, the Forest Act is there to promote sustainable use of forest lands, with a specific need to maintain and enhance the forest health. And then in Ontario, to provide for the long-term health, and the Act, it actually says sustainability, but then it goes on to define sustainability as long-term health, but it's the long-term health of our crown forests, and then again, with consideration of socioeconomic and other environmental values. So this is not an exhaustive list. You know, by no means think that this is just only 3 provinces that do this, just in 20 minutes and with a little number of slides. Didn't want to go too deep on it. And of course, the emphasis is mine just to draw attention to that long-term forest health, which again, really is a precursor to biodiversity. So conserving biodiversity in practice, you know, the regulatory statutes, the regulatory frameworks, certification, all these other considerations, you know, they really are sort of that commitment, the sign off, this is we're going to do things properly, but what actually happens in practice, and this is a bit of a generalization. There are different approaches across the country at the provincial and territorial level, even at the sub-regional level. But we typically see a 2-pronged approach within the managed forest. And again, that slide that showed the pink subset, that is the managed forest across Canada. There's sort of a 2-pronged approach. One is the landscape level approach, which is to essentially emulate natural disturbance patterns. And you'll recall I mentioned that our forests, particularly our boreal forests, are very dynamic ecosystems, fire and insect disturbance driven. You know, disturbance is nothing new to those forests. So consideration of emulation of natural disturbance patterns that governs where harvest practices take place. How big are the cutovers? How close together should the cutovers be to one another? And the idea is to create or maintain a natural forest condition. So that really goes to what trees exist on the land base in terms of their stands, how old are they, where are they located in proximity to one another. And the idea is that if we can emulate these natural conditions under which all flora and fauna species have evolved, then we will continue to provide habitat for all species. So that's the landscape level. This is often called natural range of variation, ecosystem-based management, some call it a coarse filter approach. But really all of these things drive how we conduct sustainable harvest and renewal. And a lot of long-term planning goes into that. So it's looking at what was there before, but it's also modeling things out for 100, 200 years to sort of see, okay, where are we in relation to a natural forest condition? And if we are off, how do we manage our forest appropriately to get there? So that's at a landscape level. You know, when you operate at a landscape level, you do not necessarily address all of the attributes that are important for biodiversity or long-term ecological health. So there are local level considerations. Some might call these fine filter. There's a whole variety of different definitions or terminology that goes with it. But what this does is, with on top of that landscape level approach, it really addresses some species specific needs. So this can be buffer zones around nests. This can be buffer zones around water bodies. It can be buffer zones around calving areas for ungulates. And it also addresses the conservation of ecosystem function. So you want to avoid rutting on your sites. You want to avoid siltation into water bodies. You want to retain residual structure on site, similar to say a firewood. That creates a natural seed source. It creates habitat for various wildlife species. So it's at a 30,000 foot level, it really is this two-pronged approach that's embedded into Canada's sustainable forest management practices that provide for biodiversity. And just to give a sort of an illustration of this is an actual example that comes off the Pick Forest in Ontario. And again, just to emphasize, you saw from those excerpts of the various provincial acts and policies, conservation and biodiversity come first. So it's the identification of those biodiversity attributes that's paramount, and recognizing those and ensuring the appropriate conservation measures are in place it is what comes first. So we've done some internal work at FPAC, and approximately 50% of a given area within the managed forest is subject to those conservation measures. So that can be long-term deferrals for caribou habitat. That can be riparian buffers around water bodies. That can be the temporal and spatial buffers around bird nests. And on top of that, there are other considerations and set-asides. There's archaeological reserves, there's considerations for tourism, there are wetlands which are avoided. But all of these things come together to provide the basic approach to the conservation of biodiversity. And ultimately, it's less than 0.5% of the managed area that is harvested and sustainably renewed each year. And this is not a new concept. It's a concept that's entrenched in science, it's entrenched in policy, it's recognized as a leading edge approach to sustainable forest management and biodiversity around the world. And so just a couple of quick excerpts from the Canadian Biodiversity Strategy. It recognizes that the emphasis on landscape and waterscape level planning. Speaking to species at risk more specifically, Pan-Canadian approach, which is a relatively new concept or initiative, is a collaboration between the provinces and territories and the federal government to realize that the species by species approach that we've historically taken to species at risk may not be the most effective or efficient way of getting that thing. So there's discussions around shifting from that single species approach to one that focuses more on multiple species or ecosystems, which again is very much in line with that landscape level approach, that emulation of natural disturbance. And again, just to note that this is my emphasis added. So that's the commitment, that's the practice. When it comes to monitoring and accountability, it is exhausting just how many audits, monitoring protocols the forest sector undergoes, and that's understandable when you operate on a publicly held resource. There is a definite need for transparency and accountability. But do want to touch on certification, which I mentioned before. So forest certification goes outside and in some cases above and beyond the regulatory framework. And they're voluntary mechanisms. They're developed by independent bodies. They're audited by independent bodies or third parties. And what it is organizations have developed standards that say, this is the standard you need to meet for us to consider you sustainable in what you do. And if you meet those standards, then you get to put that organization's logo on your products. There's the Canadian Standards Association, Forest Stewardship Council, and Sustainable Forestry Initiative. Those are the three certification standards that exist in the Canadian context. All three are recognized internationally by foreign governments in international marketplaces, and all three specifically address biodiversity in their standards. So just a recognition that Canada is a world leader when it comes to sustainable forest management, biodiversity conservation, and that is reflected when you look at certification around the world. And so we have 9% of the world's forests. We have 36% of the world's certified forests. So we're punching well above our weight class. While only 11% of the world's forests are independently certified, 77% of Canada's managed forests are certified. So again, we really are leading the charge when it comes to responsible forest management, again, with a very, which includes a very specific focus on biodiversity. I hope I've kept that to time. And again, I'd just like to thank the OBC for the opportunity to present today.
Great stuff. Thanks so much, Scott. That was really informative. I think it's you've hit on a number of fantastic points throughout the presentation. Probably too many to stay within the time frame. But I think one of the ones that I caught was certainly the ecosystems are dynamic. They're always changing, they're always evolving, and I think it's again sometimes a perception that forests are permanent, that forest, it will stay the same in perpetuity, and it just, of course, isn't the case at all. Certainly with the disturbance patterns that you recognized and described, they're constantly evolving. So I think that's such a good thing to keep in mind, and certainly, and I'll probably maybe pose a question if there's not too many questions at the end, but certainly consider, with climate change, how is that going to impact legislation, and how is that going to impact how we manage forests in the future? I won't ask the question quite yet. Maybe we can consider that down the road. So our next speaker this afternoon is Ian Dunn. And Ian is a graduate of Toronto's MFC program, Masters of Forestry Conservation, and a registered professional forester, and has been with the Ontario Forest Industry Association for a number of years, and was recently promoted to the position of president and CEO. So certainly, Ian, congratulations for that, and very, very well deserved. And we have Forest Ontario and the OFIA have a great working relationship and partnerships, and working on a number of initiatives. So it's a pleasure to have you here, Ian. And with that, I'm going to hand it over. Oh, you're still muted.
How about now?
There you go.
We're good. Okay, yeah, thanks so much for that introduction, Rob, and absolutely really value the relationship that we have with Forest Ontario. And thank you again for the invitation today. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to the Ontario Biodiversity Council for hosting this important panel session this afternoon, and thank you to Elder Dorothy Taylor for your words on developing a spiritual relationship with the land. And I'd like to think that a lot of my colleagues, the reason they got into this line of business was because they wanted to save the forest. They had that connection with the land, and I just wanted to thank you for those comments, because they did ring true for me. And I also just want to echo the previous speakers' comments around the traditional lands that we're all coming from today. And yeah, so my name is Ian Dunn. I am a registered professional forester and the president and CEO of the OFIA since January of this year. This is a really exciting time for us, and I'm very optimistic about what the future has in store, not only for our industry, but for our northern, rural, and Indigenous communities across the province that depend so much on the sustainability of our industry. So the title of the session is Mainstreaming Biodiversity in Forestry, which I think is a really interesting way of framing this conversation. I would argue, our industry, unless you live in Hornpain or Timmins or Thunder Bay, is often anything but mainstream. We have an increasingly urban population that is becoming a little bit more detached from the realities of making a livelihood from our natural resources. And I think this is particularly true in Ontario, where most of the population is centered in the GTA. And so my presentation today That's part of the role of the OFIA, is to educate and inform government and the public. My presentation today is going to focus a little bit more on private land, or public land rather. Gareth is going to be speaking more to private land afterwards, and Scott provided a great overview of the federal context. So, you know, this idea of sustainable forest management, it's often, you know, very difficult to describe to the layperson why this is a good thing, not only for generating wealth and prosperity across our northern and rural communities, but also for maintaining and improving the health of ecosystems, not just minimizing impact. And if there's anything that I want to leave you with today, that is it, that forestry really is a force for good. So our organization, the OFIA, has been around for 78 years now, and the focus, when it was first conceived back in 1943, was for forest companies to come together and discuss the best methods for conserving our provincial forests, and it's very similar today. We have over 40 member companies producing a wide range of products, including energy and electricity, dimensional lumber studs for your house, engineered wood products, and pulp and paper. Our members also sustainably manage public forests under license to the government, and conditions of these licenses include authoring forest management plans, harvesting, forest renewal, road building, maintenance, and of course compliance with all applicable laws. The total area of the management units or the forests that OFIA members manage is almost 30 million hectares, which is about 4 times the size of New Brunswick. So it's a massive amount of area and a huge amount of experience around the table. And of course, mills are scattered throughout the province, in the Ottawa Valley, in the Northeast, and Northwest. And that's the perspective that comes to our committees. That's the perspective that comes to our board table. It's the entire province. And when we look at issues or policy that is impacting the sector, we're looking at it through the lens of what is best for the province as a whole, you know, not what is best for each individual company. And it's a very similar situation to FPAC. So forest products are gaining a lot of attention right now. The UN projects that global demand for forest products is expected to increase by more than 30% over the next 10 years. And consumers are realizing that forest products are critical to a sustainable bioeconomy. And we're witnessing this kind of cultural shift towards sustainably sourced forest products. And I think this presents a great opportunity for Ontario. You look at other jurisdictions like BC or Alberta, where you've had the devastating impact of mountain pine beetle and fires. They're not as strong of a position as Ontario. There's a lot of excitement right now around the use of mass timber in tall wood buildings, particularly here in Toronto. And I think that's just a great way of getting an urban population excited, not only about the material that's used in the construction, but also beginning to make those connections and supporting the process that actually creates it. And, we ultimately forget that this is a plant that grows from energy produced by the sun, and something that captures carbon and stores carbon as it grows. For example, the tallest wood building in Canada right now is in BC. It's called Brock Commons. It's a residence at UBC. It's 18 stories tall, has over 400 beds. So you can imagine it's a huge amount of wood volume, but it takes North American forests only 6 minutes to grow that wood volume. There's not many other building materials that can claim it grows in a certain amount of time. So I think the message that I want to leave you with on this slide here is that, there's lots of opportunities out there, things I haven't even talked about in terms of recycling, clean fuels, packaging, low cost, low carbon electrical generation, and so on. So I wanted to give you a bit of a sense of the footprint of Ontario's forest industry, and I know Scott did an excellent job at providing the federal perspective. We harvest very similar to the when you look across the country, we harvest only 0.2% of the total amount of forest each year. It's a tiny fraction of the total amount, and of course, it all has to be regenerated successfully by law. And with that, very, very small impact on the landscape, we can generate significant social, economic, and environmental values to the province and its citizens. So $17.5 billion in total revenues, 143,000 direct, indirect, and induced jobs. And of course, it's not all about driving economic activity. This money supports over 70 million trees being planted annually by the industry, over 300 million seedlings or seeds being used to regenerate previously harvested areas. And of course, there's compliance and effectiveness monitoring in place to make sure that we're undertaking these activities successfully. And again, I think back to Scott's slides, this is a very highly regulated and complex operating environment for companies. And all of these benefits directly support northern, rural, and Indigenous communities across the province. And we at OFIA work very closely with a number of municipal and Indigenous organizations because everyone knows, what's at stake and just how integral this industry is to prosperity across the north. So now, I guess the reason why I came to present to you today, a brief introduction to the Crown Forest Sustainability Act, or the CFSA, and how we manage for biodiversity and species at risk in a forestry context. And again, Scott did a great job providing an overview. I'm going to focus a little bit more on Ontario's policy framework. So the CFSA was passed in 1994, and it really fundamentally altered the province's approach to forest policy. The CFSA aimed to manage Crown forests to meet social, economic, and environmental needs of present and future generations, really the definition of sustainability. The Act was passed as a result of the Timber Class EA hearings that took place in the early 90s under an NDP government. And millions of dollars, thousands of hours were spent in consultation with the public, with experts, with biologists, foresters, forest industry, environmental organizations, to really answer the question, can forestry be practiced sustainably under a class environmental assessment? And the answer as a result of all this was a resounding yes. Most importantly, under the CFSA, the philosophy of forest management through the M&R officially became more focused on environmental processes or ecological function rather than simply supplying timber to the mills. So these are the two principles of the CFSA that I have listed on this slide. I think the one I'm going to focus on more today is the second one. The long-term health and vigor of Crown Forest should be provided for by using forest practices that emulate natural disturbances and landscape patterns while minimizing adverse effects on a whole range of social, economic, and environmental values. And of course, that is easier said than done. There's currently over 2,300 pages of requirements and direction through guides and manuals that forest managers have to follow in order to achieve these two principles of the Crown Forest Sustainability Act. So how do we implement this and how do we achieve those goals and principles? So there is an incredible amount of public and Indigenous consultation that goes into authoring forest management plans. There are annual reporting and notification requirements, compliance efforts, scaling, wood utilization, wood measurement, all regulated through the CFSA, plus third-party certification like FSC, SFI, like Scott mentioned. But what I wanted to focus on today was this idea of a coarse and a fine filter. And that is really delivered through our landscape stand and site guides. And I'm going to try to provide a visual representation of what this looks like in a couple of slides to follow. But the idea is that biodiversity is most likely to be conserved by the applications of both filters on the landscape. So a coarse filter provides habitat for a wide range of wildlife through the emulation of natural disturbances. So we're looking at large landscapes at this level. How are we going to achieve the tree species composition, age class distribution, and structure and pattern across large landscapes over time that we would expect under a totally natural regime? with fire, insect outbreaks, drought, etc. If we can achieve that through forest management, in theory, we will be able to provide for a wide range of early and late successional wildlife habitat, and that would include species at risk and species like caribou, which really depend on these kind of landscape level habitat needs and interactions. From my perspective, the ultimate goal of forest management in Ontario is creating this natural landscape. It isn't for timber production. In fact, that's usually the last consideration after all these other objectives have been met. And it shouldn't be about caribou habitat. The goal is to create a natural forest through forest management, to which all of these other species have adapted to over thousands of years through natural processes. And success is really evaluated by comparing what we would expect under a pre-industrial, totally natural forest condition with our current forest inventory and where the forest is headed into the future based on growth and yield information. Now, is that a good thing? I'm not so sure. I think landscape targets are incredibly important and really separate Ontario from many other jurisdictions, including jurisdictions in Canada that simply don't have them. But we should be trying to create, should we be trying to create forests in Ontario that we would expect 300 years ago? Or should we be looking at the realities of today, thinking of climate change, fire suppression efforts, and really the opportunity to intensify our silvicultural practices to produce more volume per hectare? You can probably guess where my head is at on that. Regardless, that is the ultimate goal on our landscape right now, creating this natural forest condition and providing for this wide range of species. A fine filter may also be required for species or other cultural or environmental values whose needs are not necessarily captured by that coarse filter. And that is done primarily through area of concern prescriptions under the Stand and Site Guide. I think the tree marking guide would also be another excellent example of this, and I think Jody is going to be speaking to that a little later. But an AOC, an area of concern, is a defined area within a forest that is a non-timber value that could be impacted by forest management operations, either harvesting, road building, road use or maintenance, tree planting, etc. AOC prescriptions may include no-cut reserves, modified operations, or conditions on access and timing. So for example, some operations have to fall outside the critical breeding period for a number of bird species. Other AOCs could include bat hibernacula, brook trout lakes, cultural heritage sites, wolf dens, whippoorwill habitat, etc., etc. The typical forest management plan on Crown land in Ontario has over 100 pages of AOC prescription conditions in order to protect these individual values, and they continue to grow and expand over time. And one last point on this slide, which I think is really important, is this commitment to continuous learning. So our policy framework in Ontario includes a commitment to active adaptive management. We develop forest management plans, we implement those plans through operations, we monitor, and then we evaluate. And it's a continuous cycle of continuous learning. And I think that's a really important element that sometimes we forget about. So I'm going to provide you with some visuals for both the coarse filter landscape approach and the site level protections that I hope will drive home the message of how our sector manages, protects, and conserves biodiversity. So I hope this is coming across. I know it might be a little difficult when we're streaming a presentation, but showing what happens on landscapes over long periods of time is challenging. But Google Time-Lapse provides us with a really interesting glimpse of how dynamic our forests truly are. And this gets back to Rob's point after concluding Scott's presentation. So this is a 3-second loop beginning in 1984. And in those 3 seconds, we see 37 years on the same area of forest in Ontario. Now, this is just a small segment of forest just a little north of Red Lake, really at the northern tip of where we see forest operations in Ontario. But if you look closely, a lot is happening over those 37 years. You can see fires, You can see potential insect outbreaks. You can see a decline in forest health in certain areas. You see a variety of forest ages. You see renewal and a little bit of harvesting in kind of the central bottom right area. And you can tell, I mean, this is not a uniform, consistent forest. It is constantly changing. And that is what we're aiming to achieve on a landscape level, an emulation of these natural disturbances to provide at a coarse scale a forest structure that a variety of wildlife species have adapted to over thousands of years. And this is a very, very small glimpse. You know, forest managers often plan 120 years plus into the future. And there's over 57 million hectares of productive forest in Ontario. So you can just imagine the modeling, the planning, and operational efforts that are involved in this. So at a finer filter through AOCs, the next several slides I've actually taken from the Algonquin Park Forest Management Plan. And on this slide is the operational scale map legend. It includes the identification of 58 area of concern prescriptions, or AOCs, that are used to map either known or unknown values on that forest. And as you can imagine, as more values are captured on the landscape and more AOCs are developed, maps have gotten extremely complex, which often creates significant operational challenges. So this is just an example. The colors here are a variety of different AOCs, and each with their own conditions, either no-cut reserves or timing restrictions or road use restrictions. So you can imagine, planning operations in this kind of environment is incredibly challenging. And what I want to do over the next couple slides is just illustrate what this fine filter actually looks like when you apply it to a forest, and how through the protection of biodiversity, areas eligible for forest operations are whittled down very significantly. So again, this is Algonquin Park, which includes a total of 760,000 hectares of total area. So we're going to start minusing out these values. So this is non-forest or non-productive areas. So water, brush, alder, swamp. That's an additional 144,000 hectares that you would net out of that total area. Minus unavailable forested area. So these would be sites with access limitations, shallow soils, bypassed areas or islands, and that comes to another 7,500 hectares that you take out. Minus policy withdrawals. So the Algonquin Park Forest has a park management plan. This would include wilderness zones, nature reserves. That represents another 175,000 hectares of forested area unavailable to operations. That brings total production forest area to about 57% of the total area. Minus FMP withdrawals. So these are the AOC reserves. That's another about 43,000 hectares unavailable for forest operations, bringing us down to about 51%, plus the modified areas through those AOCs. That represents an additional 47,000 hectares of area. So these areas can be cut, but again, there's some kind of operational restriction associated with it. So it could be a timing restriction or access or silvicultural. I could go on for quite some time, but at the end of the day, we are left with approximately 17%, or about 126,000 hectares of the total park area. So that is the reality of managing and protecting biodiversity on our forests. And then again, that is just one example of one forest. There's about 41 forests across Ontario. And these are the everyday challenges that forest managers face to maintain biodiversity in a forestry context. This idea of a coarse fine filter approach is really central to the work our sector does. And I hope I've left you with more of a clearer understanding of what our industry does, and really the demonstrated commitment our companies have made to biodiversity and species at risk. And all of this, of course, requires significant planning and scheduling to make it all work, and something that's quite difficult to explain to the mainstream. But I am very thankful that I had the opportunity to present to you today, and thank you very much. And with that, I might hand things back to Rob.
That's awesome. Thank you, Ian. It's similar to Scott. So many great points that we could talk about for hours. I think it's interesting to know too, just those slides about Algonquin Park, which were really revealing. The consideration that the park is obviously unique. It was established years and years and years ago, primarily to ensure that agriculture didn't impact the overall the forests that were there and maintain some long-term timber supply for the forestry sector of the day. But I think what's really important to note is that all of the Crown lands across Ontario are managed similarly. Like certainly they're all under the Crown Forest Sustainability Act. As Scott indicated earlier, they're all subject to third-party certification. And so I think it does really bode well to the point that, and I think you mentioned this too, that I think here in Ontario, we probably have the best managed forests in the world because of all of the things that we do, including the Crown Forest Sustainability Act and such. One point that I'm probably going to just try to tease a little question that I might ask at the end if we don't get too many questions coming from folks listening. But you did mention, the management of, should we be planning for the management of forests the way they existed 300 years ago? Or should we be, and so here's the question, should we be looking more what those forests naturally would be 300 years from now? And in fact, how would you even try to anticipate what they could be, 300 years from now? And again, given climate change and all those factors. So just as a teaser there, when I consider that, if we have time for questions at the end there.
For sure.
Yeah, no, so again, thank you so much, Ian. That was a great presentation and great overview on what we have here, what's going on here in Ontario with regards to forestry. I'd now like to ask Jody Hall to come forward for her presentation. Jody is a registered professional forester, holds a master's degree from Lakehead University, and along with working with, now wait for it, the MNDM-NRF. How many new business cards had to get developed because of that, Jody? Interested.
I just called it MN and something.
There you go. Good call. That's a good one. Anyway, and as along with all that and working with the government, she actually as well oversees the implementation of Ontario's world-renowned tree marking program. And I can tell you, I actually took the tree marking course back in its very early days in the early 1980s. And I can tell you it has evolved considerably since then. And I know the amount of values that need to be considered by the tree marker. And this is, of course, the boots on the ground. This is where the rubber hits the cement. Trees are being selected. I'm not going to take away your presentation, I hope too much, Jody, but it really is the essence of sustainable forestry. And we've got these folks on the ground that are certified, and they are choosing which trees to take and which to leave, and they're really creating the next stage of that forest. So it's such an important job, and hats off to all the certified tree markers that are out there that again are making so much of this happen. So Jody, it's a pleasure to have you here today, and I will hand it over.
Thanks, Rob. Well, first, I'd like to make a correction in one of the things you said. I don't oversee the tree marking program. I'm considered a newbie in the instructors, so I'm quite humbled to work with a lot of the instructors and the foresters and biologists involved in this program. I do agree it's world renowned, and some great minds, some passionate people. So again, I'm a newbie, so I hope to do the tree marking program some justice. And mentioning that, a lot of the material I'm going to present today was originally developed by Brian Naylor. Some of you may recognize that name. He's retired from the ministry a couple of years ago. He was a biologist with the policy division, so I had the opportunity to work with him for a couple of years. So I also hope to do some of his presentation some justice. So yeah, I'd like to acknowledge that I live and work in the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe people. in the Robinson-Superior Treaty. And I think the actual agenda seems to be working out quite well. We had Scott, of course, talking about landscape level and local level approach to managing biodiversity. And then I had Ian talking specifically more about Ontario and area of concern. So it just leaves me, I can drop maybe a couple of my slides and spend more time focusing on how we actually implement this on the ground, in particular in Great Lakes St. Lawrence Forest in the province of Ontario, where partial harvesting is undertaken. So that includes the selection harvest system and the shelterwood system. So hopefully I can move my slides along here. There we are. Just a brief outline. I'm going to give you a very high level description of tree marking in Ontario, how tree marking contributes to protecting biodiversity in our forests, and through three different main approaches: protecting critical and sensitive habitats, maintaining special habitat features, and reporting new values. So tree marking is basically, I only have 20 minutes, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time describing it, but it's deciding which trees to harvest and leave, and based on an individual tree level, and it's based on taking an assessment of individual growth, health, its product potential, as well as wildlife benefits. And it's been practiced in the Crown Forests in central and southern Ontario for quite some time. So I believe it's been practiced since the 1960s. And as I mentioned, it's undertaken in partial harvest silvicultural systems, so our selection and shelterwood systems. And my next slide will go into a little more description on Ontario's Crown Forests. So a lot of the my slides moving forward will speak to requirements on Crown Forests. However, many people for their private woodlots on private lands also hire tree markers to help manage diversity in their forests. So they tend to follow the same regulations, whether it's private land or Crown land. But in Ontario, on Crown Forests, it's mandatory to have your selection and shelterwood blocks tree marked. And this is because historically many forests in the province were subjected to unregulated harvest, including clear cutting of tolerant hardwood forests, which necessarily is not a silvicultural system that's suitable to their ecology, and high grading, which was basically selecting the best and the biggest quality trees and leaving the whatever's left behind. And these types of disturbance over history led to forests with irregular stand structure, unpredictable growth, and poor spacing of smaller diameter trees, as well as a lack of generation of favorable species. And so currently, tree markers are trained and certified. They're required to pass a week-long training course and then undergo an audit of a tree marking exercise before they can actually undertake that work. And so that tree marking program is delivered by the Canadian Institute of Forestry and Forests Ontario, and quite a few of those courses are going to be starting up this fall. I'm going to skip this slide. We've heard from Scott and we've heard from Ian about the coarse and fine filter approach to managing biodiversity. So, I mean, we've heard it all before. So I'm just going to spend more time describing how we actually implement this on the ground at a stand and site level. Go back. Sorry, just skipped a slide there. So as Ian mentioned, the coarse filter is really focused on emulating natural disturbance. And when we're talking about that, we're trying to recreate the patterns created by disturbance, such as fire, insects, windstorms, and of course, plants and animals have evolved to exploit the conditions natural disturbances create. And so if we use forest practices that emulate natural patterns and processes, we hope to create a mix of habitat conditions that support most plants and animals. So tree markers will implement prescribed silvicultural systems or the coarse filter to ensure the desired forest regenerates on a site to ensure the various wildlife habitat requirements are met. So when tree markers are marking for selection and shelterwood management, they're actually managing for biodiversity. So you can see in here, your selection harvest, this is into our tolerant hardwood forests in the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Forest region of the province, dominated by sugar maple, beech, white ash, yellow birch. And so the selection harvest aims to emulate gaps from individuals or groups of trees killed by insects, disease, or wind. And the shelterwood harvest emulates small periodic ground fires, windstorms, and insect infestations. So that tends to be more suitable for species such as white pine, red oak, yellow birch, a little bit higher intolerance to shade. So one of the ways on the ground at the fine filter scale, tree markers protect biodiversity or looking at biodiversity in their marking is through identification of stick nests. And quite often nests are found during tree marking for the first time. They're very important features on the landscape for wildlife. Birds that are capable of building them may use them for decades or years. And once abandoned by those nest makers, they become prime habitat for other birds that aren't capable of building their own nests, such as owls and other hawks. So tree markers are trained to identify these nests, report stick nests for protection, and modify their marking based on the area concern prescription in the forest management plan. And when an area of concern is applied, nests that are active, so actually being used in the breeding season, require more protective measures than inactive nests. And so tree markers, well, how do you determine if a nest is active? Well, tree markers are looking for evidence of birds flying off or on the nest, birds perched near the nest, eggs or chicks in the nest, down feathers on the nest or below at the base of the tree. Some hawks prefer to apply fresh green foliage decoration on their nests. That usually is a sign of an active, recently used nest, as well as eggshells or whitewash on the base or nest of the tree. Also dens. Again, tree markers are probably some of the first with boots on the ground finding these values. And so dens used by black bears, wolves, and other fur bearers are protected by provincial law. And as with birds' nests, again, most of these won't be known at in advance of marking. So they're responsible, tree markers are responsible for looking for and identifying these features, reporting them, and applying the appropriate area of concern prescription so that they're protected during operations. Tree markers are also modifying their marking patterns around lakes, ponds, and rivers. You can see in this attached selection of a map on Smythe Lake. As Ian has mentioned, we have a no harvest reserve where they would not undertake any marking. As well, we also have some modified reserves in our area concerns for water features where marking is permitted, but it may be modified. So it may be limited to 60% crown closure of trees that are 10 meters tall. Again, we get into streams, which are smaller than rivers. Many streams as well will not be shown on forest management plan operations maps, simply because they're too small to map out. But however, they may not hold fish, but they're critically important to fish habitat downstream. These tend to be the headwater features that feed into larger streams. So they're very critical in providing cold water inputs as well as nutrients. So there's a lot of leaf matter, a lot of litter matter, lots of logs falling into these, and so that feeds further down into the aquatic ecosystem. So tree markers always have their eyes out open for these, and they will apply the appropriate prescriptions depending on whether it's a permanent stream or an intermittent stream, so meaning it only flows for part of the year. And so depending on its permanency, they will apply different protection levels. Again, as well, tree markers also have their eyes on wetlands in the area. So, for example, provincially significant wetlands are protected with area concerns, so they will modify their marking in and adjacent to those features. Woodland pools are often called vernal pools because they fill with water in the spring as the snow melts. They're normally not connected to streams or other water features, and they typically dry out late in the summer. Because of that, those alternating periods of flooding and drying, they're not generally good fish habitat, but that actually makes them excellent habitat for some amphibians, such as our spotted salamander, because there's no predatory risks from some of the fish connected to the larger water systems. So tree markers will modify their marking around woodland pools in an attempt to maintain the shade over and adjacent to the pools so that it reduces the rate of water evaporation. So, and you can see in the pictures here on the left, this would be a woodland pool in the spring full of water where amphibians can breed. And the picture on the right, not the exact same pool, but later on in the summer where it is dried up. Oh. Species at risk. There's about 30 species of threatened and endangered species that could potentially be encountered during tree marking operations. And these species range from lichens to plants, turtles to birds to bats. And as Ian had mentioned, the Crown Forest Sustainability Act was amended to exempt forest operations from certain prohibitions in the Endangered Species Act, provided they're undertaken under an approved forest management plan. And so some species at risk habitat will be known before tree marking, and the direction of protection may be identified in the tree marking prescription beforehand in itself. However, again, in most cases, tree markers will be the first people to find these values. And so tree markers are responsible to know what species occur in their areas of work, to look for these values and be vigilant, to identify the species when encountered, and to report those observations to the ministry. Maintaining special habitat features. So these features we attempt to maintain to, again, emulate that natural disturbance pattern. When a disturbance goes through, it doesn't always impact all the trees. There's some structure left, and that structure exists in certain trees. So there's a requirement to maintain wildlife trees, and it's the responsibility of the tree marker to identify the best trees available for these habitat values and to mark them. They often mark them with blue paint, and there are different types of wildlife trees based on their function. We have cavity trees, mass trees, scattered conifers, super canopy trees, and veteran trees. And that's the veteran trees apply to the shelterwood harvest system. You can see here the recommended densities that are required to be retained. So cavity, mast, and scattered conifer, as well as veterans. The requirement is to retain at least 10 trees per hectare on average, and 1 super canopy tree for every 4 hectares. So the next 4 slides, I will describe each one of these types of wildlife trees. So about cavity trees are probably the most important wildlife tree type. Again, try to target larger trees, assuming that the cavities will be larger and have more habitat value with their size. So we emphasize that cavity trees need to be 25 centimeters diameter at breast height. About 25% of all birds and mammals use holes in cavities for nesting, denning, roosting, resting, feeding, or hibernating. And they include some of the best. There are different levels of quality cavity trees. So from left to right on the slide, pileated woodpecker cavity trees or cavities are high priority, have the highest value. They're the best ones to keep. A woodpecker will excavate a hole anywhere between 10 and 12 centimeters tall, 7 to 10 centimeters wide. So a fairly large cavity, and it will extend 75 centimeters down into the tree or above. And so actually, once that pileated woodpecker is finished using that for a nest, it provides a lot of habitat opportunities for our secondary cavity users who are not capable of making the cavities themselves. The illustration on below the cavity by the pileated woodpecker is a hollow tree, again used by bats and chimney swifts. The cavity in the middle is a natural cavity created by where a branch would have been removed. Again, a very good example of a cavity. And then on the right, we have a couple of not so good options, but basically better than nothing if that's what you have to work with. We have an escape cavity at the base of the tree that could be used for escaping predation. And as well, we have woodpecker feeding cavities there in the bottom. Again, not as deep and not as of high value. So when you're out tree marking, it's really hard to, sometimes can be really hard to see these cavities. I can experience it for sure. And it takes, I think, some experience for tree markers to basically get to develop that skill for looking at things. And the tree markers are constantly scanning for cavities as they walk. So they're looking for large diameter hardwood trees. Again, cavities tend to be built in hardwoods more than in conifers. They're looking for what we call trees that are unacceptable growing stocks. So are trees that we probably don't predict to be in the next harvest cycle. So to be not around in 20, 30 years, usually signs of rot or disease, and that tends to where birds will make cavities more. Again, they'll be looking and listening for bird activity, and you might actually even see wood chips at the base of the tree from where the cavity's been excavated. So they're looking for these things, and they are marking the trees based on those observations. Mast trees. Mast refers to edible fruits of overstory and understory plants. We have hard mast, which such as acorns from oaks or beech nuts from beech trees, and they're consumed by about 25% of the birds and animals that live in the Great Lakes St. Lawrence forest. We also have soft mast that doesn't have quite as much value as the hard mast in terms of energy obtained from the food source. But example here in the slide is black cherry from the black cherry trees. Mast is a very important food source for black bears for feeding. And so tree markers, when they're out in a block marking, they're looking for the red oak, as it's the most important mast species, followed by the other oaks. And then priority-wise, beech, black cherry, hickory, basswood, walnut, butternut, and ironwood. And they're also looking for mast trees that have those large crowns in the dominant or co-dominant in the canopy. That means those trees are more capable of producing higher volumes of mast. So they will mark those trees to retain. Scattered conifers are another thing tree markers are looking for. They're used by about 10% of the wildlife that inhabit tolerant hardwood forests. Deer are dependent on winter conifer cover for thermal shelter and access to food because the conifer is, of course, better at intercepting snow in the winter than the hardwoods that lose their leaves. Some songbirds, such as the black-throated green warbler, specifically seek out conifer trees in a hardwood stand to build their nests. They won't build their nests in hardwoods. So very important that if you have scattered conifer in the block that is being marked, to retain those where you can. And priority is for the long-lived species. So hemlock's a really good scattered conifer tree, white spruce or white pine, and balsam fir, even if you have, that's all you have in your stand. Super canopy trees. I think we've probably all seen these over your lifetime in the forest. Big, usually tend to be massive white pines that will tower over the canopy. They tend to be greater than 60 centimeters diameter, and they actually have a lot of wildlife habitat value. Eagles, as some of you may have seen, like to build their nests up high, adjacent to riparian areas, adjacent to lakes in some of these big trees. They're important for foraging for bark cleaning bird species, and bark cleaners will go up and down a tree, and the rough bark of these large trees hold a lot of insects, and so they actually seek out the larger trees with this rougher bark, the crevices holding a lot more insects, so they're much more efficient at getting their food. And as well, black bears will use these large trees for refuge and bedding. So current guidelines require to retain 1 for every 4 hectares. So if the markers are seeing these trees, they'll mark them for retention. And reporting new values. Again, a very critical part of the tree marker's job. Not all forest values, as I mentioned, will be identified beforehand, and tree markers are the eyes and ears on the ground. And if they find critical and sensitive habitats, such as hawk nests or patches of rare plants, before any operations can take place, they're best positioned to take the mitigation measures into action. So it's every tree marker's responsibility to report previously unidentified features in order that the appropriate protection and mitigation measures are in place. So hopefully I have stayed on my time. Really likes to skip slides here. If you're interested in, again, 20 minutes is not enough to go through the full tree marking program, but if you would like more information on Ontario's tree marking program, that I have the following website there, or you can just Google Tree Marking Ontario. You'll get to the site. And I'll end there. I have a question slide, but I'll leave that website up.
Okay, well, that's awesome. Thank you, Jody. It is great to see, you know, as I said, the boots on the ground and where the decisions are made on that future forest, what it's going to be, and all the considerations that tree markers have to take into account when they're trying to figure out which tree to mark. I know back in the day when I had to do some training of my own crew for tree marking, you'd go about a half a day or a day at it. You could just see the smoke come out of people's ears, you know, with all the considerations. Just too much when you first start. And it does take, I think, what's that?
It's just a mention. I after I started working with Brian Naylor a lot, I was concerned with silviculture, and so I was always looking on the ground, looking at the number of trees, looking at the species, looking at the distribution, looking at the site prep, looking at the, and after working with Brian, I always now looking up and tripping and falling, and so I think he turned me into a biologist, that's for sure.
Yeah. Well, you do as a tree marker. The tree marker, I think you get a pretty sore neck, you know, always looking up, and kind of hopeless to wear a helmet unless you got a strap on it, because those are constantly falling off.
Yeah, there's a whole different world up there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I do remember those early days of tree marking when I was out working with a forest manager. And at the time, you know, we were looking at hemlock stands and hardwood stands, tolerant hardwood stands. And the comment of the day was, if you see a hemlock in a hardwood stand, you take it out. They said you manage hemlock over there and hardwoods over here. And of course, now, and certainly more recently, since the Crown Forest Sustainability Act, it's no, you absolutely have to maintain that hemlock just to maintain the diversity. You know, even if it's a UGS or whatnot, you really want to focus on that diversity. So again, how the knowledge has grown and people have adapted to certainly currently and what we're looking at with maintaining that biodiversity. So that's just excellent. So thank you again very much for your presentation. And there's a great link URL to anybody that's interested in taking the tree marking course. As Jody said, it is administered by the Canadian Institute of Forestry and Forests Ontario. So we're more than happy to have folks come on out and learn all about tree marking and all the things that are considered. So thanks very much, Jody.
Yep, anytime.
See you again. I would now like to introduce Garrett Cockwell. Garrett's the Managing Director of the Limberlost Forest and Wildlife Reserve, and he is quite an accomplished forester in his own right. He is a graduate from Sir Sanford Fleming and from New Brunswick, and so has the best of all worlds there under his belt. And certainly Garrett does a great job of managing the Limberlost Forest and Wildlife Reserve. I know I've visited it many a times, and I can tell you it is probably one of the best examples of multiple use forestry, certainly in Ontario, if not Canada. And so, Garrett, it's a great pleasure to have you here today to talk about that kind of diversity within the Limberlost Forest. And so thank you very much for being here, and I'll hand it over to you now.
Thank you very much, Rob. That's a very flattering introduction. I appreciate it, and I know that you're one of our frequent flyers here, so we always appreciate seeing you. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we are managing, and I'm actually presenting from land that has traditionally been stewarded and inhabited by the Anishinaabe people, specifically the Chippewa and Ojibwe peoples, under the Robinson-Huron Treaty and the Williams Treaties. So let's make sure, sorry, we've got control here. What we plan on speaking about today with regards to multiple benefits managing private lands is management of about 250,000 acres between a group of 3 properties, being the Limberlost Forest and Wildlife Reserve, the Timmins Forest and Wildlife Reserve, and the Haliburton Forest and Wildlife Reserve. We've quite a lot that we can cover, and I'm going to try and keep it in time here. If there are any questions, please do save them for the end. I'm more than happy to discuss all the properties. I could happily talk myself blue in the face, but we're really going to focus on Limberlost. Forgive me, folks. I just need to back up with these controls here. So the collection of approximately 250,000 acres makes us one of the larger private landowners in Ontario, as well as in Canada, given the context of the ownership. For your understanding, 250,000 acres is roughly twice the size of Singapore. And beyond the management of all 3 properties, we can describe it as being on 3 founding principles, and that's that we manage sustainably, multi-use private land stewardship. Beyond that simple summary, we refer to the land ethic, the social license, and the economic returns. And in this case, the land ethic refers to ensuring that we're working hard and conscientiously to ensure that we're treating the land well, being responsible with our actions. The social license refers to ensuring that we are being good to our neighbors, to our users and our stakeholders. And of course, the economic return refers to ensuring that we are running an economically viable business that allows us to continue to invest in the future and keep our lights on through our operations. So the Limberlost Forest in particular is where we have the most well-developed multi-use with an emphasis on ecotourism program among the 3 properties. It's approximately 10,000 acres, predominantly hardwood forest, lots of lakes, tons of trails, wetlands, and special features. We work with quite a tight team. There's about 5 of us who are on full-time, and then a flurry of other contractors and operators and consultants who help us through the rest of our operations. And while we do run an economically viable business, the real focus of the property and one of the founding principles that's been shared among the founders is that of the land ethic and social license. That's sharing the property as open as we can and presenting good infrastructure to give people the opportunity to have positive outdoor experiences here. So if you have heard of Limberlost, you've likely known us from our hiking trails. Lots of trails around lakes, out to pretty places, nice boardwalks, neat special features like large quartz outcrops, significant old growth hardwood stands, that sort of thing. We offer approximately 75 kilometers of hiking trails throughout the property. All of these are accessed from our main gates just north of, in between Huntsville and Dwight, north of, in the northern part of Muskoka. The rules are pretty simple for free day use. It's 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. You download it, everything's done online now. You fill out a waiver, provide us with some emergency contact information, read the rules, play it safe, have a good time, make sure you're out in time. Otherwise, we come looking for you, make sure you're not hurt. If you haven't been out yet, it's kind of worth it. Give it a shot if you guys are in the neighborhood. We're open every single day of the year. So the vast majority of the trails that we offer to the public are built by hand. Most of them are either restored old trails or new trails close to the water and through some pretty unique areas. When I say that they're hand built, I mean picks and shovels, clippers, wheelbarrows, tough work, good work, and evidently successful, but laborious and time consuming. This built by toil approach accomplishes a few key things for our hiking program. And it means that we can delicately work through sensitive areas, we can come close to water, and it means we can traffic other tight areas that would otherwise be untrafficable with heavy equipment. You'll find that the hand-built trails currently make up the vast majority of the available trail network, but we're starting to supplement with other building opportunities, although we continue to build by hand. For example, if you guys are coming by, you should check out the Health Trail. It's one that on towards the end of this fall. So speaking of the mechanized restoration efforts, in a lot of cases, we've gone into rehab or address issues with past forestry operations that were either conducted 25 years ago, 30 years ago, or as recently as within the last 10 years. So the idea here being that we've got some bad running, we have interruptions to surface water, or we're interfering with water control. We have to go in to repair these things in any event. So let's make nice trails in between, step up the quality a bit, and then complement our other recreation programs like our groomed ski trails and groomed snowshoeing trails. So the 10 kilometers or so, we're probably up to about 14, 15 now towards the fall that have been restored in this manner. They're all exclusively off water. Now, interestingly, they're farther away from our base camp and they've again become eligible for some of that greater distance rec like mountain biking and skiing. So some of you folks might say you've got miles and miles of trails to begin with in a relatively small property. You're not in such an urban area. Where's the demand? Why do you need more trails? Well, there's a good reason for that, and it goes beyond the serendipitous trail development as we go rehab legacy infrastructure. It actually is a traffic concern that we have at the moment. One of the things which we really try to present in order to achieve that goal of giving people that positive remote wilderness experience is you don't want to see 12 different groups as you do go out and as you do go out hiking. We have traditionally seen the vast majority of our activity occurring in the top 2,500 acres of the property, where there's another 8,000 acres that are available with interesting special features, good roads infrastructure, and now developing trails infrastructure for four-season recreation. At the moment, we expect that we'll close out 2021 having had approximately 250,000 users through the property. So as you can imagine, spreading that out over a significant land base will lead to a better experience for everybody, rather than keeping us all in what we call that heritage block, that top 2,500. So, and in addition to that, we're also endeavoring to create some real groomable ski circuits. We have a lot of in and outs. They were groomed trail network of convenience, so roads which we wouldn't otherwise plow in the wintertime, we were grooming and again offering that free day use, offering people the opportunity to come out skiing, trying to remove any barriers that there might otherwise be. This additional development allows us to create circuits, make for more interesting ski, attract a little more attention, and get a little more of that winter traffic out here. Ultimately, we're trying to share a bit more of the land base with an ever-growing following. I'm sure you can imagine the last 2 years have been a wild increase in demand, and we're trying to do that while aiming to keep us spread out a bit. And not to mention, there's just a ton of other cool and interesting things that people have the opportunity to experience as we push that safe infrastructure a little bit farther out. So all this recreational expansion does mean that our wildly confusing road network and trail network does become a little bit more confusing. It should hopefully also translate into a little more peace in the woods. And so generally speaking, why do we think it is important? Why is it important for people to get out there, or get out here rather, and have a bit of fun in the bush? And the real reason we do it is because we've dedicated a team and our time and our resources and sweat and careers, etc., because we believe without that tangible experience or access to a place like Limberlost or something similar, it's difficult for folks to develop an appreciation for the forest and for natural spaces. And for those who have already had a piece of that, who already have a bit of that bug, continuing to have that accessible at a place like Limberlost helps them grow their own appreciation and share that with others. So we've created a significant chunk of infrastructure that gives folks a chance to either test out hiking in Ontario hardwoods, or become frequent flyers, or keep up that fun, share with others, share it with family. So to really dumb it down, hopefully everyone after a good experience here walks away and that was fun. Natural spaces are nice, they're rare, we should protect them, we should respect them, we should conserve them. Now I understand why I should care about conservation and respecting the natural spaces that are available around us. So the trails do get used by a lot of locals, cottagers, folks traveling. We're coming into color season. We'll see a whole chunk of communities coming up here in the next couple of weeks. But we also have a lot of access and use by education groups and not-for-profits. The group pictured here is a cohort from the Trails Youth Initiative, which is an organization that brings inner-city youth to wilderness areas. In the case of Limberlost, they come up normally twice a year, not more than that. Things have been a little tough with COVID. And while they're here, they participate in leadership exercises, canoeing, outdoor education hikes, and they also help arrange and participate in our larger events like the trails, the Limberlost Challenge Run, which is a long adventure race that normally would take place here every year. And so again, this gets back to our fundamental philosophy about sharing that land whenever possible, and in particular with youth and with youth groups, and trying to plant that seed as early as we can, and to help use it as a leadership and growth experience. So we also work with another group called the Pine River Institute. In the case of Limberlost operations, the Pine River Institute brings youth at risk to campsites in the winter. So they camp literally right through the winter. They normally start towards the end of November, and they're here until the snow clears, and they take their program elsewhere. So this includes having kids winter camping in bivy sacks and in hot tents right through those toughest days when otherwise we'd often rather be having a hot shower or tucked away. And now in both the case of the partnership with the Trails Youth Initiative and the Pine River Institute, what we feel again that we accomplish here is creating that opportunity for a positive experience for the participants when they're out in the woods, but one that they can take with them and share and continue to develop and grow as they build their own experiences and build their own lives and families. Okay, so now the question that a lot of you not in the know, aren't too familiar with Limberlost, are probably saying is, that's a ton of land, that's a lot of expenses, you're not a charity, you're not a government funded, and you don't charge for day use. What are you guys doing? How does this work? And in short, we generate revenue off the land in two ways, primarily, and that's forest products and cottage rentals. In terms of the land ethic as well as the economic return, we do conduct some forest management, fairly limited in the grand scope. You may have encountered some of our operations. Generally speaking, though, you haven't, as we've kept them in more remote areas of the property. And the scale is, again, generally small, as is the harvest volume. We tend to conduct a very conservative form of single tree selection. We've just heard a great presentation from Jody about that. We're actually pretty excited about tree marking at Limberlost. We've had a number of certified tree markers who are here and have worked their way through the program. And again, in this case, individual trees are marked by certified tree markers who are identifying the stand conditions and individual trees, as well as individual site conditions, which is a really great way to apply a broader prescription across a small area. We try to make sure that our forest operations are also complement our recreation program. And this means strategically marking main trails or access roads or tertiary roads that will be of value to the larger program in the future, and whether that's part of the overnight accommodation rental program that we'll talk about in a minute, or whether that's part of our free day use and day recreation program. So an example of a conservative application of a single tree selection harvest is seen in this photo here. The harvest was conducted in the winter of 2009, and in this case, the photo was taken between 2016 and 2017. You can see that we were light with the saw. We did come in. We identified we had a number of diseased trees. In this particular harvest, we didn't have any major insects or disease that we were targeting. But in addition to being light with the being conservative with our actual marking in terms of volume, we also were quite hard on our operators, making sure that we were cutting our tops down so that we could see them degrade more quickly. For us, this helps to reduce any impediment to recreation after the fact. So instead of waiting for a couple of years for tops to break down, really quite rapidly, it becomes quite a nice appearing forest, and one that's great for hiking or for other recreation. Additionally, it appears to us in some areas of these stands that they would be eligible for another thinning within the next 4 to 5 years, if not sooner than that. So the harvest operations that we do undertake are primarily focused on stand improvement and addressing any special concerns depending on the neighborhood, depending on the composition. So for example, beech bark disease has been a major issue in some of our higher beech content areas. And these, although in some cases they are closer to a base camp, we've decided that we will address them as rapidly as we can. We do also produce some significant volume. Small, but in our case, a significant volume in the form of saw logs and firewood. So in this case, that sustainably harvested private material may end up heating a house or building houses or building floors of the tractor trailer that just dropped off your Amazon delivery. Ultimately, though, our harvesting program is not a huge part of our overall. It is currently focused on improving the sustainability of the stands of timber, as well as complementing our recreation program, and then finally ensuring that it is an economically viable harvest. It's very difficult for us to enter into a stand if we aren't making sure that we're touching on each one of those three principles. So the real backbone, the other benefit, and what allows us to keep our lights on here and continuing to look at investing further in the property is the overnight accommodations program. So in addition to our free hiking and harvesting, we also have accommodations. These range from large, fairly accommodating chalets to large cottages, small cottages, and even rustic bush camps that used to be fish camps and hunt camps. Generally speaking, something for everybody with a variation of levels of amenity. We're quite busy, obviously, through the summer, just like all of Muskoka. We have a nice black booking schedule, and then we actually carry it through all 4 seasons. In most cases, these areas remain accessible. They're right on the water, and again, we see groups of individuals who are interested in the rest of the recreation program participating in the sustainability of the overall program by renting out these cottages. And so from the accommodations revenue, we're able to keep the whole business viable and earn that return that allows us to continue to grow. And then beyond the cottages and chalets and camps, we have a glamping program, which, again, for those of you who don't know, is glamorous camping. So essentially imagine a wooden tent with an outhouse and for the later months, a propane furnace. There's no electricity, there's no furnishing. It really is camping, just without the headache of, you know, your family not having had set up the tent correctly. So you get to go out there, have a lot of fun, adventure with camping, except that you know that you're in an easier building and an easier setup, and you're not hanging off a tree. You get to use an outhouse. In addition to that, we also have quite an extensive car accessible camping and drive-in camping program throughout the property. This basically means safe fire pit, picnic bench, an outhouse, and in some cases, a wooden tent platform. So just a 10 by 10 deck. We do not, however, have a camper trailer program. No travel trailers at Limberlost. So all of you who may be familiar with owning or renting accommodating cottages with running water close by and all the amenities of modernish cottage, why should you care about camping? Is it something that's important? Well, we think that absolutely yes. For Limberlost, in addition to making contributing significantly to our overall financial sustainability and allowing us to keep our gates open and our trails available, camping is very much so also a part of our larger goal to offer that positive, safe outdoor wilderness experience and help people have a good time when they're out in the woods. We're endeavoring to provide not just the cottaging, but also other affordable ways for just about everybody to give it a shot and have not just a day outside, but an evening or a weekend. And if it doesn't work out and the weather goes bad and the kids are belly aching and the bugs are awful, well, you can always hop back in your car and have the safety of knowing that it's easy for you to get back to the bright lights in a more civilized area. Ideally, though, the experience for most campers and even novice campers is that they get to have an easy, doable camping experience, and they're not stacked one on top of the other like you would see at a lot of more conventional campgrounds and provincial parks that offer that drive-in camping experience. And on top of that, all 60, save one campsite, is on the water. And so instead of fighting for a space, fighting for your own piece of that serenity, you do end up nicely spaced out with your own area. So we also quite openly hope that the introduction to camping, this drive-in program for people is not necessarily the end of their development of that experience, but that it becomes a launching pad, and that folks will break out a bit more and go on to explore what other opportunities are available here, but available to all of us all over the province and all over the country, and again, continue to develop that appreciation for outdoor spaces. So again, the intention of the program which we run at the Limberlost Forest is that we are hoping to share and continue to develop people's understandings of the value that can tangibly be had and be seen at the Limberlost Forest. So we're aiming, again, for that really simple response when someone walks away after having had a nice hike, and that's that they say, aha, that was fun, natural spaces are nice, they're rare, we should protect them and respect them, and now I understand why I should care. Now, if anybody has additional questions, I'm more than happy to answer anything about the Limberlost Forest, but I do believe that, hopefully you've seen that in the case of a large private land under management in Ontario, we found a way to balance our land management, our forest management program with a larger ecotourism and community program throughout the property.
That's great, Garrett. Thank you very, very much. Great presentation, and I can certainly, as you indicated, I'm a frequent flyer of Limberlost Forest and can certainly speak to the beautiful accommodations that we've had there, both relatively small ones for a small, just I think it was 2 or 3 of us, down to a larger group of 15 to 16 folks that we had there. So it certainly suits all. So I'd highly recommend anybody that's listening today or knows of folks that are looking for that solitude kind of experience to certainly look up Garrett and Limberlost Forest and the Wildlife Reserve. It's certainly well worth the trip. Well, thanks very much, Garrett, for your presentation. Very, very informative. And finally, and certainly not least, I'd like to introduce Elizabeth Selinovich. That's not Liz, by the way, on that slide. I'm not quite sure how that happened, but anyway, Liz is a graduate from the University of York in 2007 in environmental studies and resource management, and has certainly a long career in forest restoration, and is extremely knowledgeable. There's Liz. is extremely knowledgeable in all the components necessary for the supply chain of a successful afforestation programs. We were very, very fortunate to have Liz join Forest Ontario just over 2 years ago, and certainly now Liz, as the Chief Operating Officer of Forest Ontario, continues to develop the programs, the afforestation programs and partnerships and the structures and all the components necessary to ensure that we do have healthy forests for the future. So Liz, I'll hand it over to you, and thanks again for joining us today.
Thanks, Rob. Just a quick question. If you see my presentation.
Yes, I do. Beautiful.
Is it the presentation or
just the presentation pics? Yep.
Perfect. No notes.
No notes.
And not all the other screens.
You're freestyling.
Okay.
Yeah,
all right. Well, thank you, Rob, and thank you everyone for inviting me here to speak with you all. And really interesting talks from all the other presenters. So thank you for that. And you know, seeing that or hearing the different perspectives of forestry and forest management, and just listening to Garrett's presentation really makes me wish I was camping right now. So definitely going to look into some of those spots you mentioned. So with my presentation today, my focus will be on how to ensure that forest restoration through tree planting efforts create resilient, healthy, diverse forests for our future. And this all starts with ensuring that the right tree is planted in the right place for the right reasons. Before I start, I would like to respectfully acknowledge that I'm on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, and the Chippewa, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. So to start, I just wanted to provide an overview of Forest Ontario, our organization, and what our mission is. So Forest Ontario is a non-for-profit organization focused on forest restoration through tree planting, stewardship, forest education, and awareness, as well as creating healthy forests for our future. So tree planting is our major cornerstone of Forest Ontario's mission, and our main large-scale tree planting program is the 50 million tree program, which was established back in 2007. So since then, together working with our network of planting partners, we have successfully planted over 34 million trees across Ontario, creating 17,000 hectares of new forest cover. And through this program, we also were able to engage with over 6,000 private landowners. So I just wanted to show a map of just some of the areas that we've planted through our program. And again, a lot of it is in Southern Ontario, but we are trying to plant as, you know, across Ontario and wherever the opportunities are. Just this past spring, even through a pandemic, we successfully planted close to 2.8 million trees and are now preparing for next spring, and really excited to see how that unfolds, because we already have so much interest and so many landowners wanting to participate in the program. So we look forward to that. So as we know, our forests are nature-based solutions to fighting climate change and helping sequester carbon, improve our environment, our health, and our economy. We know that trees and healthy forests provide many essential services and co-benefits, and we need to continue to enhance our forests and our natural ecosystems in order to improve our air, our water quality, prevent flooding, soil erosion, creating and maintaining recreational opportunities, just like we just saw, improving the benefits of our physical and mental health. Even just this past year, or the past couple years, we've seen a lot of, you know, landowners or public wanting to find that green space to escape and just, you know, come out of the house and just be in nature. So making sure that we have those green spaces for everyone to enjoy. And also it's creating more jobs, and it's supporting our communities and, again, our economy. So it is known that a target of 40% tree cover is required to ensure that all essential services supported by our forests, like our water and air purification, wildlife habitat creation, carbon sequestration, continue to be provided. It is known also that Ontario, currently right now, we have about 26% of forest cover, and some areas of southern Ontario have as low as 5%. So there really is, a variation of forest cover on the landscape, and in trying to enhance that and connect those fragmented areas. So most importantly, increasing forest cover isn't as simple as just planting trees. Ensuring the right tree gets planted in the right place with maximum survival requires a complex infrastructure and long-term support and financial commitment. And most importantly, it's not just planting a tree and walking away. It's a complex system that requires essential infrastructure in order to successfully create resilient and healthy forests for our future. And it all starts with seed. This is an essential component of this complex infrastructure, and we need to ensure that we have that high quality source identified seed. And we need to ensure that these seeds are then secure and we have enough seeds to produce enough high quality seedlings that are able to support all these different planting programs and these targets and the high demand that we currently are experiencing. But it's not just having trees available to us to support our programs, but it's also ensuring that we have those planting partners, the network of trained and experienced planting partners and tree planters that have that capacity to plant all these trees we're growing. And once they're planted, these trees need to be monitored for several years in order to ensure successful establishment. So again, it's not just planting a tree and walking away. It's really that long-term monitoring to ensure that those trees eventually will become a healthy forest for our future. And all these aspects of tree planting need to have an integrated approach. And we need to ensure that the capacity and infrastructure is in place in order to successfully enhance our forest cover. And main thing here is these are all connected. You can't, enhance seed collection but not have the capacity to grow that stock. And then having that stock, you need to make sure that someone's able to plant it and we have the sites available to plant those trees. And then once those trees are planted, we need to make sure that we're following up and we're making sure that they're able to survive, they're able to establish into a closed canopy forest that eventually will contribute to our forest cover. And as I mentioned, seed is essential, and seed collection is the key component to ensuring that we have the right trees available to us. We need to ensure that we have enough source identified, genetically diverse seed available to produce high quality, resilient seedlings that will have a good chance to survive and establish once planted. We need to ensure that there is enough capacity to process these seeds, to test them, and also to store them for the long term. And that way maintaining that long-term supply to support the tree planting initiatives. For example, we all know the federal 2 billion tree program was announced, and there's a lot of interest and a lot of, even interest from landowners to participate. But how do we ensure that, once we start planting these trees, that we have enough capacity to maintain it for the long term? It's not just a couple years, it needs to really be a long-term sustainable program. So it is essential that we start increasing our seed inventory in order to meet those demands over the next few years, and of course making sure it's the right seed that's getting collected. So this is just a map of some of the collection areas that we currently collect in, and we have currently in our inventory we have over 204 million native seeds that will support our 50 million tree program. And it's not just, we have these seeds and we're good to go. We need to continue to collect each year to increase our inventory and the diversity of the seeds that we have. So here it just represents all the different seed zones that we've started to collect in, and also the different species that we've been collecting, our main species. But all of this would not be possible if it wasn't for one of the main components, which is seed collectors. And, and again, these are essential to the success and the establishment of healthy forests. So currently, Forest Ontario works with a network of seed collectors across the province. Seed collectors put a lot of effort and countless hours into seed collecting, more so for seed forecasting than collecting seed and cones. And in order for our trees and our planting efforts to be successful, we really need to make sure, as I mentioned, to have that long-term support to collect these seeds and to support these seed collectors so that they can continue this essential work over the next few years and for the long term as well. And again, it's not just collecting seed just for tree planting. When we look at all the different ecological restoration opportunities that we have, one of the main things that that we notice that is a challenge is not having enough seed to supply some of these restoration projects. So again, it's not just collecting seed for forests, but grasslands, wetlands, and all the different types of ecosystems that need that restoration and that native seed source. Another key component is having the right trees available each year. This requires long-term financial commitment for nurseries to invest in their infrastructure and increase their capacity to grow high-quality stock to meet the targets and the demand. One of the most important components to note is that growing stock takes a long time, and it takes time and planning, and nurseries need to plan 2 or 3 years or even more in advance to make sure that the right stock is ready for planting. We need to ensure that we provide enough time to our nurseries to prepare and plan their fields to be able to commit to these future targets. And after speaking to several of our nursery partners, we have started noticing that a lot of them are ramping up their production and their capacity to support the high demand. I'm sure everyone has noticed, and if you're looking to buy some trees the past 2 years, just given COVID, a lot of landowners, a lot of people are trying to increase their own green space in their backyard or wanting to be more active and wanting to plant more trees. And nurseries have said many times that spring and fall are so extremely busy, and a lot of times a lot of the stock ends up being sold out just because of that high demand. So making sure that we support that infrastructure today in order to have those trees for tomorrow is really, really important. And even just having those trees in the nurseries is this as important as making sure we have the sites and having partners to plant those trees. So through our partnerships and working collaboratively with our network of partners, we work with over 87 planting partners across Ontario through our 50 million tree program. This includes different conservation authorities, stewardship groups, municipalities, First Nation communities, a lot of different forest consultants and forestry professionals. And in order to increase that forest cover and making sure that we plant those right trees, we need to have a network of trained, experienced planters to do that. And that those boots on the ground, how Rob mentioned earlier, is making sure the boots on the ground are there to increase that forest cover for the long term. And these planting partners, our boots on the ground, work directly with private landowners and provide a full service planting program. So this includes going out to site, doing site inspections, making sure that the site is appropriate for tree planting, preparing site plans, and ensuring that the right tree is planted on that site, preparing a site plan for the landowner and meeting their objectives as well, and providing guidance as to why we plant the trees we plant and what are the long-term objectives for both the landowner and the forest. And also, as I mentioned, just ensuring those right trees are planted on that site. They also oversee the planting operations, the tending, the monitoring of those newly planted trees. So making sure we have that support is key. And again, ensuring that these partners have long-term funding support to enhance their capacity to provide these services in those areas. So again, having that funding support to, hire more staff, train more staff, having the resources to be able to complete the tree planting projects, having the right equipment, also having outreach support, and also, having that funding support to reduce those planting operational costs to then encourage more landowners to participate in planting. And again, as I mentioned, just the outreach and trying to find those right sites to plant those trees. So the big question that has come up, especially with the 2 billion tree program, is, do we have enough space to plant all of these trees, and where do we plant all of these trees? And how do we support, an objective like 2 billion trees on the landscape? So we actually, Forest Ontario looked at a couple studies that were completed over the years to determine what that potential land availability is to restore that forest cover. So here's just an example. So this is a Landsat study that was done by MNRF back in 2000, and it estimated that over 1.2 million hectares of pasture and or abandoned fields were available in Ontario. It was also estimated that these open lands could accommodate close to 2 billion trees alone just in Ontario. Another study that we looked at just recently, we received a study from NCC in 2019, where they identified areas across Canada that have high priority areas for conservation and restoration. And so here this map is just showing where those potential marginal open abandoned lands are, and based on their total land availability, it was projected that close to 5 billion trees were able to accommodate these lands. And I just want to note, just in terms of the tree numbers, these are just really high level estimates. It's just a projection, so it's not exact. And again, it really does vary depending on the different types of planting projects and the density that those trees are planted. So this was sort of just a standard density just to see what that overall number would be. And so when we look at all these potential areas, we need to determine where the right place is to plant these trees and make sure that it will provide the greatest environmental, ecological, social, and economic benefit. We need to determine the priority areas and have a strategic approach to ensure that we achieve the greatest value and these co-benefits associated with healthy forests. So for example, we need to identify areas where there's fragmented ecosystems or isolated natural areas or ecologically sensitive areas, and use tools such as the natural heritage system to help enhance some of these natural features, such as the interior forest cover that is really essential to a lot of different birds and wildlife. And also protecting those natural areas and those ecosystems that need that protection, that natural cover. So also looking at the availability of marginal unused land, that's one of the main objectives for the 50 million program, is really trying to find where those abandoned farmlands are that are no longer productive and where we can establish new forest cover and again connect a lot of these fragmented areas and essentially where those lands are no longer in use, and just enhancing that forest cover and establishing it a lot faster, as if it was, left alone and abandoned. It would take many, many years for that to actually become, a early successional forest, and sometimes not necessarily ideal in terms of diversity, because you do have, the pressures of invasive species and things like that, and not ideal species that may come in and take over a lot of these fields. So again, bringing in those native species into these types of sites is essential, and again connecting those adjacent woodlots. And one of the main things that I just want to point out is it's identifying the different lands and identifying the the open land and different opportunities, but making sure that there's different planting objectives associated with them. So again, there's different approaches when it comes to forest restoration, whether it's creating a brand new forest or a new forest stand, or creating or enhancing a riparian buffer near water or drainage features, or whether it's a windbreak to prevent soil erosion, or even to create wildlife travel corridors. And most importantly, one of the main ones I would say is important, not just creating new forests, but really is restoring and enhancing existing woodlots. And these are woodlots that may be affected by extreme weather events, fires, invasive species, whether it's forest pests or diseases, or even plants. We also need to find different opportunities and enhance forest cover where we need it the most. So again, looking for those high priority areas that would benefit forest cover. And again, looking at all those different values and benefits associated with that. So when it comes to finding the right place, we know that most of the land in Southern Ontario is privately owned. We need to put more effort into landowner outreach and engagement. We need to also educate and bring awareness of the importance of healthy forests. And we need to, with these landowners, need to establish a long-term relationship so that they have that support, but also that they feel confident in that tree planting program and those forest management programs that may be available to them. They need, when it comes to landowners and tree planting, especially large scale, sometimes it is not necessarily, an easy choice, or they may not know exactly, is it a good thing for their land? Do they really want to do it? And if they do, a lot of times landowners, they worry, well, how do I take care of these trees? What do I do? Especially when it comes to large hectares of land. So making sure we have the resources and providing that support and guidance, I think, is very key, so that the landowners know how to become stewards of their land and how to manage their woodlots as they start to establish into a closed canopy forest, and then over time managing into those mixed diverse forests. We need to also educate landowners on one important fact, that it takes time to establish a healthy forest. It's not just planting a tree one year and that you're going to have, a sugar bush in a few years. It does take time. It does take planning, maintenance, and management. So again, making sure that the landowners have those resources to make the right decisions for their woodlot. So one of the main things, just in my old role, and even still, I find, when it comes to talking to landowners, a lot of times when you're, talking about tree planting, especially when it comes to afforestation, a lot of times their view of plantations, for instance, it's a monoculture, and there's very little diversity in that forest. But really trying to give landowners the information and an understanding of why we do what we do. Why do we plant these trees? Why do we select these types of species? And again, just explaining that this is just the beginning of that conversion from open land into that mixed forest or mixed diverse forest. But again, it takes, planning and long-term commitment in order to achieve that goal. So just when talking to a lot of landowners, when you're saying, let's plant an area that you're not using anymore, and they're sort of like, how does that look like? What kind of trees am I going to get? Am I going to get Christmas trees, or how big are they? So really, having resources and having information to share with landowners and educating them on, exactly what is tree planting and what would they expect as those trees establish. I find showing, visually sort of a representation of what you would expect on your landscape as they establish is really important, because sometimes they don't realize, when you say we're going to be planting seedlings that, they're only a foot high. Sometimes they're expecting, large caliper trees, or they're not really expecting what they got. So again, making sure that providing them with the right resources and information when they're making those decisions to plant the trees, and making sure that they'll be able to care for them after. So here's just an example I wanted to share. So this was a newly planted planting in the springtime, and this was 3 years later. So again, seeing how quickly those trees do grow. You know, and a lot of times landowners say, well, I'm going to plant the trees today, but I won't see them tomorrow, or I won't see them in a few years. But that's not true. So here's another example of an 8-year-old planting, another 15-year-old planting, where now it's becoming more of a closed canopy. They're starting to touch, and now you actually have, you know, more of a plantation. And again, you know, as they're establishing, making sure that landowners understand, and the previous presentations were excellent in making sure that, you know, there's tree markers out there helping landowners identify when their woodlot needs to be thinned, or, you know, making sure that they're doing it for the right reasons, and also making sure, you know, that they're protecting those sensitive areas, they're protecting those stick nests and different wildlife habitat when they're doing this this type of management. So just an example of a 30-year-old plantation, you know, first thinning, and then a 45-year-old plantation after their second thinning. And again, you already see that transition, you see that understory coming up in that regen, and that seed source coming into those areas that have been recently opened up. And I find sometimes even just showing this picture to landowners in the past, they didn't believe that this was once a white pine plantation. And so just showing that it takes years, and this is an 87-year-old white pine plantation, you know, you do see some of the pines still there, but you see so many different plants, and it's so, you know, biodiverse when it comes to plants, wildlife. And again, it all started from just, you know, putting a seedling in the ground to now having this mixed diverse forest. I recently, together with Fraser Smith, we put together this video, and I find it very helpful to share this with landowners. It sort of gives you a tour of what a plantation looks like when you just plant it into a mixed diverse forest over the several years and several thinnings. So if anyone's interested to see that or share that with landowners, or anyone that is curious as to why we do afforestation and how that plantation is converted into that mixed forest. So here's a really great example. I really like this photo because it's really showing how we're enhancing that connectivity. This land is marginal, it hasn't been used. You already see some regen coming in, and we've planted this site where now it's going to establish into you know, a continuous forest and adjacent to all these other woodlots as well, and really enhancing that forest cover. So this is one of my favorite photos because it really does show that connectivity. You see that plantation adjacent to a hardwood forest, and over time, as we're going to manage that forest, it's all going to be a mixed forest over time. And really seeing that from this lens is really interesting, because, you know, when you're walking through plantations, you're always looking up, you're looking down, but looking down from this perspective just shows you a really different perspective, and a really great appreciation of, you know, how we connect all these different forests to become one large forest. So a couple things that I wanted to mention. So again, you know, this is an excellent example of what the right reason is to plant trees. And again, making sure that the greatest benefit is to our environment, our health, our community, and our economy. So planting is one of the best and easiest nature-based solutions to address climate change, as we know. And there has been a lot of interest, as I mentioned, in tree planting initiatives across the world and in Canada, and more landowners are interested in planting and participating in these projects. So we need to make sure that we have the capacity and infrastructure in place to meet these demands and these targets. We need to ensure that all the components are supported, from the seed, the stock, the planting, and other components such as that long-term monitoring. We need to make sure that we're supporting the monitoring of those newly planted trees and several years after the fact, to make sure that that they're established and that they're able to meet that free to growth state, to then eventually become that mixed diverse forest, just like this photo. If we don't monitor these trees, then we don't know if our restoration efforts are good, or if our approaches, are the right ones, and if our forest management practices are, creating those mixed forests, or those, restoring those healthy ecosystems. So just a quick, I just wanted to show this quickly. So this was a study that Forest Ontario did with NRCan, which was conducted last year. And so we looked at, or NRCan looked at our tree planting survival data and all the sites that we've planted through the 50 million program from 2008 up to 2016. So based on the total hectares planted through the program over those years, 83% is still on the landscape and thriving. So it's a good indication that our tree planting program and all our efforts in ensuring the right tree is planted in the right place is successful in creating those new healthy forests. And just some key aspects and takeaway points that I just wanted to highlight quickly is that we need that long-term funding commitment in order to achieve that healthy forest for the long term. We need to make sure that we have that support from all levels of government, partnerships, sponsors, donors, and individuals. We need to be able to stack these dollars to support tree planting operations to help reduce those costs and encourage more landowners to participate in tree planting and forest restoration. We need to make sure that we enhance the capacity of all these aspects of tree planting and maintain them for the long term. This can only be done by working together on the whole supply chain. And as I mentioned before, it's an integrated system and connected. So we need to make sure whatever we enhance, whether it's seed to stock, that we have the capacity to make sure that we have the expertise on the landscape to plant those trees, but also having, capacity to monitor those trees and look at if what we're doing today is going to be beneficial for our future, and also, making sure that it's going to help fight climate change, and again, applying some of that climate adaptation when it comes to tree planting and what we do today, and hopefully, those trees will do well tomorrow. We need to continue to work in collaboration with our partners like Forest Chain Conservation Authority, or Forest Chain Conservation Association, Conservation Authority, stewardship groups, and all the different partners that we work with. And again, we need to continue to educate and bring awareness to the importance of diverse forests and all the aspects and the infrastructure of tree planting needed, such as I mentioned, the stock, the seed, the stock, the planting, the tending, the monitoring, and the long-term management. And most importantly, bringing awareness that creating healthy forests takes time and proper planning, and it's a complex system that needs to be connected from seed to forest. And the main focus of tree planting is not just to be a target or a tree target to be planted. The main goal should be creating and enhancing hectares of healthy forest cover that will protect our environment, our health, and our economy for the future. So we need to ensure we do it right in order to achieve multiple wins for the climate, biodiversity, and people. Thank you. We have 20 minutes. Hopefully that wasn't too long.
No, that was perfect. Just perfect. Thanks, Liz, for that. Boy, oh boy, you really nailed it when you started talking about all the components necessary to have a successful afforestation program. And it's very complex, as you indicated. A lot of partners involved, and I think it's always important too, as you did, to recognize, the assistance from the governments, but also sponsors and supporters and our partners and all those folks that you've listed. So it's not there's no one organization that's doing all this. It's everybody that's participating and helping out. So you nailed that. You really showed that very, very well with all your pictures and slides and the succession of the forest and all of those things. So, you did pretty good to get all that in 20 minutes. So that's a lot of information there. So thank you very much for that, Liz. I would like to open it up now for questions. And we did get some questions in from folks. And so I'm going to move to those. And I probably don't have time to go back to some of our presenters with the questions I kind of put out there as seed questions, because we're running out of time. which is great. You know, it's good to see that we've had some really good discussions and presentations here. But we're going to get to some of the questions that were posed during the presentations. So I'm going to read them, and then I'll try to figure out who I'm going to hand them off to. So the first one is, are you participating in National Forest Week, and what's a good way to participate? Okay, well, I'm going to take that one because that's really easy. Yeah, and yes, we are. Certainly Forests Ontario is, and we've got a lot of activities planned for the week. A good way to participate is check out a number of the not-for-profit organizations out there that are involved in National Forest Week, and there's a number. There's Tree Canada, there's the CIF, sorry, Canadian Institute of Forestry, OWA, you know, ourselves, and organizations right across Canada that are going to be celebrating National Forest Week, and also the point of trying to enhance the awareness of the importance of our forests and of the sustainability of how we manage forests here in Canada. So I think it's something that we all should be proud of, and all take part in waving the flag for our forestry practices here. Okay, next question is...
Sorry, Rob, can I just jump in quickly there as well?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, no, a great answer, and FPAC as well will be participating and follow us on social media. But on a personal note, I would just encourage everyone to you know, reflect on why forests are important to you, and that can be taking a walk in your local woodland. It can be taking a walk in your ravine if you're in a more urban center like I am. But I would also encourage everyone to have a look around your home and look at all the things that are of value to you that are made of wood or wood fiber, and look at some of the things that aren't made of wood that could be made of wood, and just, you know, reflect on that. Rob, I look at your background, I can see tons of wood, you know, from where I'm sitting. You can't see it. A chair, piano, kitchen cabinets, doorways, the framing of the house, etc., staircase, guitars, right? So just you know, books. Just really reflect, take a moment, stop, reflect. We all have busy lives, but, you know, reflect on why forests are important to you. So that's just a quick add-on.
Great comment, Scott, and thanks for that. Appreciate it immensely. I'm sure the OFIA will be celebrating National Forest Week as well. And so, yeah, great comments. Again, everybody hopefully can appreciate, well, I think everybody does appreciate wood, and certainly the multitude of wood products that we have. And it's, again, hopefully today we're able to connect the dots on where that wood's coming from, and again, the fact that how sustainably it's managed and all those things that go with it. So thanks, Scott, for that. And anybody else that wants to jump in on these discussions, by all means, do so. And with that note, and I'm not sure if that works, but I'm sure if everybody could just turn their camera on. Does that work with what we're doing here? There we go. Oh, awesome. I'm not feeling so alone now. All right. Next question is, wondered why the map of Algonquin Park, and I guess this was in Ian's presentation, didn't include the logging roads. So given that it was Ian's presentation, Ian, I'm going to kick it over to you. Uh-oh. Oh, hold on. Stand by. There.
There we go.
How's that?
Can you hear me?
Yes,
can you hear me?
Sir.
Okay, excellent. Yeah. No worries. It gave me time to think about my answer, so that was good.
Drinking the glass of water, right?
Yeah, so I guess that the purpose of that exercise was just really to show the policy and AOC impacts on the landscape. So there was a lot of things that weren't on that map, including Highway 60, which goes through the center of it. But I guess to whoever asked the question, if you are interested, Ontario is really turning a corner on open data. So I would encourage you to go to the Natural Resource Information Portal, and you can look at some of the operational maps in the Algonquin Park Forest. One thing I will mention is that sometimes forest managers don't actually publicly display all the operational roads, and that's simply in order to ensure the safety of the public, as well as protect some sensitive individual values that we talked about, preventing disturbance to those values or even poaching of those values. So again, I would encourage you to use NRIP if you are interested in seeing more of those operational roads.
Great, thanks, Ian. Okay, next question. Why did forestry need to be exempted from the Ontario's Endangered Species Act? Question mark. If the coarse and fine filter are so good at protecting species at risk, why don't they conform to mandates under the ESA? And again, this is a provincial question. So Ian, are you able to field that one?
For sure. Thanks, Rob, and thanks to whoever asked it. I spent a lot of my time dealing with this question. It was a question that came up quite regularly. So, and I think you partially answered it already. So the CFSA does provide for species at risk through the coarse fine filter approach. And if there is a newly listed species at risk or a new species at risk that was recently found on a forest that doesn't have an AOC through a guide, then the local MNRF in collaboration with the forest managers will develop some kind of prescription to protect it. I guess that the conflict between the CFSA and the ESA really arose from a theme that we've heard today, which is that dynamic nature of forests. So the ESA was really designed for projects that happen on a relatively small and discrete scale. So think of a housing development, a highway expansion, where a permit can be filled out that would alter a species at risk habitat, and then a beneficial action would happen somewhere else. So you think of butternut, you can cut down 3 butternut trees here, and then you can plant 15 over here, and you can demonstrate that beneficial action. And then the activity, whatever that might be, would be allowed to go forward. That continues today under the ESA for those activities. The issue with forestry is that, and we've learned today, forests are anything but static and discrete. Forests go through ecological succession. Habitat is naturally created and destroyed. Population dynamics between species, prey and predators, fluctuate naturally. And in forestry, this is happening across hundreds of years and 57 million hectares of productive dynamic forests. The ESA is simply not capable of dealing with this. It is not a natural resource act. It requires protection of species at risk forever, which is really not a reality in dynamic forests. So, and often, in my opinion, it's at the expense of other species or even what might be silviculturally appropriate in some situations. So there's that angle. There's also the feasibility of it as well. So, I mentioned activities are typically authorized through permits under the ESA. Our association did some work years ago and estimated there would be 50,000 permits filed annually by the forest sector if a legislative change was not made. So, if that was the reality, industry and government would simply grind to a halt. And we also have to put it into context. So this is not new. The forest industry in Ontario has operated under this conditional regulation since the ESA was passed in 2007. So ultimately, we've made a commitment to sustainably manage our forests. This means balancing values, and the ESA just cannot do that. It has to be done through the CFSA, and that's why we were so adamant about that legislative change and something that government has understood for quite some time as well. So that's it in a nutshell. Thanks again for the question. It's an excellent one.
Rob,
Excellent.
I could add to that as well.
Yeah, thanks, Joey.
Yeah, to add to Ian's response there. So the Crown Forest Sustainability Act and the policy framework that's associated with it requires forest management companies to use forest management guides in the development of their forest management plans. And we provide direction on protecting species at risk in our guides. And when we're developing that direction, we're using the most current science available for those species. And we're also considering the habitat regulations, the recovery strategies, the general habitat descriptions, management plans, and government response statements associated with the endangered species act in developing those prescriptions. So it's we're not out there, you know, developing direction that's not based on or related to the Endangered Species Act.
Excellent.
Thanks, Jody.
Great. Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you so much, Jody. Okay, question 4. How can we protect biodiversity when we haven't identified all species yet? And I'm going to kick that over, unless anybody wants to put their hand up to try to take a go at that one. Scott put his hand up. There you go, Scott.
Yeah, maybe I'll just have a first kick at that and invite all the other esteemed panelists to sort of dive in here, because I think we're all our presentations have a bit of different scales, and I think they complement each other rather well. But that really, I mean, a quick answer is that really is the foundation of that landscape level emulation of natural disturbance pattern. It's based on the principles that all species have adapted within that natural disturbance pattern. And so if you emulate that and create or maintain or strive for that natural forest condition, that you're going to continue to provide the habitat for all of those species. So at the coarse filter level, that is, you know, on point in terms of why that approach was adopted within the Canadian and the Ontario context.
Excellent, excellent. Anybody else add on?
And just one thing I would add on is I think we can all agree, industry, government, NGOs, whoever you are, we need to be working with the best available information, and inventory of species at risk, forest inventory, etc. Really important, not only to understand the impacts to the species or understand what kind of state the species is in, but also to understand what kind of socioeconomic impacts we would have if you start adding, you know, no cut restrictions, timing and access restrictions. We need good inventories to understand the potential socioeconomic impacts as well. So just to reinforce the importance of, you know, inventories broadly.
Good, thank you, Ian, that's great. Okay, the next question is rather lengthy, so I'm going to try to paraphrase it. And basically, I think the question is about emulating natural disturbance patterns. And I think with it, you know, when we can talk about the boreal forest and emulating fire there through clear-cut systems, it seems fairly straightforward that we are substituting in a clear-cut type system instead of the forest fire. The question kicks in about disturbance patterns like wind throw, and certainly we see that in selection systems where we're trying to emulate, you know, the wind throw, the single trees being knocked down because of wind, which is basically the selection management system. So I guess the question is, are we truly substituting in when we're doing selection management? Are we substituting in and taking trees out that would normally be subject to wind throw, or are we actually adding to the amount of trees that would be subject to, I'll term it, wind throw, through selection, harvesting, plus whatever nature decides to knock down with natural disturbance patterns? Does that, hopefully that makes sense. So I'm gonna maybe kick this over to Jody, if you can kick that one around a bit, if it made sense at all, and see what your thoughts are on that. So I guess it's basically, are we through the selection management system, which emulates wind throw disturbances, are we truly substituting the action, or are we adding on to the action through that harvesting technique?
Yeah, it sounds like the question is related to are we creating a double disturbance in an area? Right. So I think that the key thing here is to, on the landscape, when Ian ran that the time lapse, and that's a boreal situation where you can actually see those disturbances are a little more visible, but the same thing is occurring in the Great Lakes, St. Lawrence, where we tend to do the selection harvest. You'll have those small stands go through insect infestations and wind throw. So they are seeing disturbance in a patchwork across the landscape, and just recognizing we're not selection harvesting all the forests at one time. So it's we have allowable harvests, and that allows us to harvest a certain percentage over time over a forest management plan. So I think that's how we address making sure there's not too much disturbance on the landscape at once. And when we're selection harvesting, we're, you know, the guidelines are is we're trying to maintain 60% of the volume on a site. We're really only trying to remove, you know, plus or minus 30% of the volume, and we're trying to maintain that canopy closure. So there's not a lot of large open gaps where the wind could impact more.
Okay, good. Thanks, Jody. Garrett and Liz, I know both of you have very extensive tree marking experience. Do you have any thoughts on the question?
Yeah, I'd say in our experience with stands that we know fairly intimately, I don't think you can look at emulating wind throw or blowdown as being some compensatory mortality, and that you're removing trees that would otherwise blow down. But it is something that does get taken into account even in the 2-class assessment system of each tree, where you do identify trees on the lien and they end up higher on the list of priorities for removal. And then after the fact, when you do enter into a harvest block after a significant wind event, yeah, you probably, I wouldn't surprise me if we see more trees that are down, just because we've reduced the integrity of the canopy, but not to an extent that that is particularly distressing for our managers anyhow.
Good. Thanks, Garrett. Liz, any thoughts?
Thanks, Rob. I just wanted to sort of, in terms of just, when we're doing sort of forest management and these different types of approaches, it really is, what is the objective for that woodlot? What are we trying to achieve? And whether it's, trying to simulate, natural disturbances, the end goal is we're using, good forestry practices. We're protecting, those sensitive areas, where we're making sure that we're selecting the trees that need to be removed to then become a benefit for that forest and enhancing that diversity. So again, it's just making sure our approaches, have long-term benefits, maybe not depending on weather. And again, whatever we do today, especially when it comes to thinning certain sites, it's, we're removing some of that canopy, but then, you have an ice storm, or you have, windstorm damage that we didn't predict, but it's caused more damage now, and now you have to restore, that area that you just thinned. So again, it's just having adaptive approaches and just making sure, that we're doing what we do today benefits the forest for the future.
Yeah, great. That's a great answer. And anybody else have any thoughts, comments on that question in particular? One thing I'd suggest is just talking about tree marking experience. When we do, and Garrett, you did touch on this. I mean, when we are out marking trees, and I think Jody indicated this as well, you are going for the poorer quality trees that are likely to be susceptible to that disturbance, like the UGS material, unacceptable growing stock. So inherently, by taking those out, you're assuming that those are going to be gone within a time frame 20, 30 years anyway, just because of natural disturbances, because of mortality, whatever it might be. So in essence, you are emulating if a windstorm came through and knocked down the trees, and probably would knock down those ones that are quite susceptible to the wind throw. So anyway, one last question.
Oh, can you hear me, Rob?
Yeah. Go ahead, Ian.
Just one last thought on that. And again, more of a landscape level. I think there is an assumption in the question that natural disturbances like blowdown are predictable and pretty uniform over time on a kind of an annual basis, where in reality we're working with a range of natural variation, and so it all depends on where that forest is on that box and whisker plot. And it might be that we're high in a certain age class distribution or certain species composition, but it's not additive in the sense that over time there is a kind of a range of disturbances that could be expected on an annual basis, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. Thanks, Ian. Good. Okay, one last question. And again, we are running out of time. My apologies for that. That was probably me talking too much. But I guess probably goes over to Liz. And so and you kind of touched on this already, but assuming the 2 billion tree program continues to move forward, we'll know, I guess, on September 20th, perhaps, or within a few days. But assuming that, what would you suggest the federal government needs to do? What should their approach be in ensuring the success of that program?
Good question.
Put it down the spot at all, but.
Well, I think just from my presentation, just making sure that, that all the different aspects are, have an integrated approach. Whatever we decide to do, wherever those opportunities are, that we make sure that we do it right. Right from the seed, making sure that we have that capacity, we have those seeds available to us, making sure that the nurseries are ready to do that. And most importantly, if we're going to start planting, through the 2 billion tree program, we're really not going to start planting huge numbers next spring. It really does take a long, a few years, as I mentioned, 2 to 3 years to actually have seedlings available. So again, making sure that the government takes time to really look at all the different aspects, plan accordingly, and then execute on those targets, and making sure that whatever those targets are on an annual basis are achievable, and also at the end of the day that they're done right, from the beginning. And then again, having that support, that long-term support. And again, this was a 10-year program, but really this needs to be a long-term program. This needs to be, beyond the 10 years. It's not just planting and walk away. Like I said, it's really planting and then creating those forests and managing those forests, whether it's 30, 40, 100 years and beyond.
Awesome. Thanks, Liz. That's great. So yeah, so again, I want to thank all our presenters today. You've done a fantastic job. We've talked at a national level, a provincial level. We talked about boots on the ground, on crown lands, how we're managing all those forests sustainably, how they're actually emulating and assisting maintaining and enhancing biodiversity. We've gone to private lands that are adding incredibly to that wealth of biodiversity that we have in the landscape. Certainly, we see in Southern Ontario the incredible amount of private lands that we have, and how important it is to make sure that we're encouraging landowners to manage those lands appropriately. And certainly, Garrett, your examples of good sustainable forest management is a great example for all forest owners to follow. And of course, Liz, identifying how we're going to create new forests. And certainly you identified the need to make sure that we have new forests across the landscape, and that they are developed in a way that is going to maintain themselves and be healthy. So I think it's been a great panel, and great listening to everybody and your perspectives. And I'm hoping that anybody that has any questions from the audience, I'm sure everybody's web or emails are available, so please feel free to fire them in. And thank you, attendees, for participating today and being part of this about this session. So thanks, everybody. Have a great day and great rest of the week.
Thanks, Rob.
Great. Thanks, Rob. Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
See ya.